And we are back with the fourth show of the day. It's getting crazy. I don't know where to stop. Insanity. I just like live streaming, and it's always fun to be with you guys. Just get to know you, talk to you, learn, teach, have fun. All of it. It's great. It's a pleasure to know you. I hope you all come back. I'm going to start a little song, play while you're coming back.
Where are you going? What, G-Zone?
Get back to the videos right after this. This little jam takes me somewhere. going to be back to the video here.
Progress, and it is our firm hope and purpose that this progress shall go forward. We will continue to keep the American people informed on this vital matter.
Plus the Sphinx Temple, plus the Valley Temple, plus other buildings predate the dynastic Egyptians by thousands of years, and possibly, according to oral tradition, and hopefully we'll get more science about this, prior to 11,700 years ago. So it's possible that buildings like this, some of the Peruvian, some of the Bolivian, and other ones, were built by this ancient civilization who were the victims of this massive cataclysm. The other question is, what was the function, for example, of the Great Pyramid? Of course, people say, well, it was a tomb for an arrogant king. Unfortunately, what we find is that the majority of archaeologists in general who look at foreign sites like Egypt, Peru, Bolivia, etc., they're taking their Western mindset with them when they try to interpret another people. And Europe, we know, was very barbaric in terms of you did have kings who were despots. They treated themselves as the highest level of life, and everyone else was more or less a peon. However, ancient societies in other parts of the world were not like that. The Inca were not kings, the Inca were not rulers. The Inca were caretakers. And I know that from working with native people to this day. Someone who is a chief is not the highest person. It's the opposite. He is responsible for the livelihood, and we know that the Inca were that way, so it's quite possible that ancient Egyptians, etc., were that way as well.
Of the universe.
For all the crazy, stressful things that we have to deal with in our physical life here on Earth, you know, whatever it might be.
Into the ocean.
Spirituality
archaeologists
brings
estimate there's
us back to that level
150 million tons of basalt that's stacked up into artificial islands and walls and buildings on Pohnpei in Micronesia. And this incredible city, I mean, it's actually built into the ocean. It's not even on the island. They don't know who built this. I mean, archaeologists are saying, okay, these kind of like Easter Island, where you have a remote island, it has giant megalithic remains on it. But mainstream archaeologists their explanation is, well, you know, these islanders just kind of got to this Polynesians to some remote island, and they were bored, and they had nothing else to do, so they built these giant statues. They built this huge city.
Well, all right, in this particular case with the Egyptians, Smithsonian confiscated all these artifacts, mummies and tablets and things like that. Why keep it a secret?
Well, there's a number of reasons for that. Part of it is, and it's the same reason why a lot of things today would be kept a secret. They're engineering history, and today history is politically correct. It's not necessarily what really happened in the past. It's more like what they want to have happened, or how politically correct they want, certain native to be, or something like that. Another problem, particularly out west, was the Mormons. And of all the states in the United States, you've got the universities basically teaching isolationism. That is, certainly Egyptians didn't come to North America or South America. They didn't travel. Chinese people didn't get in boats and go places. All the Native Americans walked from Siberia down through Canada, down to South America. But ships that held 300 or 400 people in Tonga. They had giant ships like that too. That were going. I mean, they were much bigger than any ships that Columbus had. You now get into things like the Piri Reis map and the maps of the ancient sea kings by Charles Hapgood.
Oh yeah, that map is incredible.
Well, right, and it seems that even like Columbus and other people, they had some of these old maps, and they were kept secret too. This was one of the things about a lot of the ancient sea routes that they were kept secret. The Phoenicians kept secrets. The Phoenicians were to talk about where they went and the ports that they went to. There's a certain a theory that, and I also go for this, that the Toltecs, whose capital was Tula in northern Mexico, they're related to a lot of the stuff in Arizona. They conquered Chichen Itza in the Yucatan at one point. The Toltecs are depicted as guys with thick beards and mustaches. They wear helmets. They carry swords and shields. They look like Phoenicians. They look like Mediterranean warriors and stuff.
Persians, everything like that.
Stuff like that, right. And in fact, it seems that probably the Toltecs were some offshoot of the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, who had already a transatlantic trade. Another similar thing there is the Phoenicians were known as the purple people, and they wore purple robes. And even the concept today of kings and queens wearing purple gowns and purple crowns and things like that, that comes from the Phoenicians, who all wore purple. And that purple color was a very special dye that they got from a shellfish. And that was a secret technique of taking this dye. Phoenicians were famous for it. The Carthaginians were also Phoenicians. But also the Mayans used also this purple dye, this same unusual shellfish dye, which the Phoenicians had a secret. Another curious thing along this line with the Egyptians and stuff is boomerangs. We think of boomerangs as being some kind of Australian Aboriginal
device.
thing.
Yeah.
But boomerangs have been found all over the world. And in fact, the Egyptians hunted with boomerangs. King Tut, in his tomb in Egypt, there was a trunk of boomerangs found in his tomb. It's part of the Tutankhamun treasure. And in fact, if you go to the Cairo Museum and you go to the Tutankhamun area, you will see on display all of his boomerangs. And he was a boomerang nut. I mean, he didn't just have a couple of boomerangs. He had a whole trunk full of dozens of them. It's well known that the Egyptians hunted with boomerangs. But if you go also down to museums like the Mexico City Museum for the Aztecs and Zapotecs and Toltecs, you'll also see boomerangs on display there. And the Hopi Indians, who live here in northern Arizona, near the Grand Canyon, they supposedly were the keepers of this secret Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon. And the Hopis also hunt with boomerangs. And they were famous for that. Prior to the Spanish conquest, that's what young Hopi warriors did. They went out with boomerangs and hunted birds and rabbits and things like that. And, I mean, these are not the kind of guys you're going to want to meet in a dark alley. I mean, they look like something out of, like, these alien movies or something like that. And, in fact, that Swiss artist, Geiger, who created that kind of look of these long-headed sort of, sort of insectoid aliens in that movie. But that is what these guys look like. And when you show photos of just your typical Olmecs, they're some weird-looking guys. I mean, you can hardly believe it.
Are you familiar with
of conehead craniums, the weirder that gets. Because
I'm not sure that they made these. These look like they're genetic mutations or they came from someplace else.
When you see them, they look like aliens, and so that's been I think a natural assumption, because when you see some of these skulls and the figurines and things like that come out of Mexico, also South America, yes, you're right. I mean, they look like they're extraterrestrials. I mean, they
look at the size of the eye sockets, David. They're huge.
Well, that's right. And
chroniclers insisted that the planet Saturn, now just a speck in the sky, had presided over the Golden Age, an epoch of abundance, cosmic harmony, and grandeur. The archaic name of Italy was Saturnia, and tradition held that this very name was given to the original site of Rome. The Sabbath, the special day of rest and reverence, was Saturni Dies, Saturn's Day, a day honored throughout the Mediterranean, the Near East, and beyond. The popular Roman festival, Saturnalia, was a symbolic return to the Saturnia Regna, Saturn's reign, the Golden Age. Much symbolic content of our own New Year's and Christmas celebrations will trace to the Roman Saturnalia and related ancient festivals.
Stories about the disappearance of this legendary island city have echoed down the centuries since it was first written about by the Greek philosopher Plato over 2,000 years ago. But is the drowned city of Atlantis just a myth, or is the legend based on a civilization that really did exist? And why are so many of us so keen to believe in it?
Like a perfect place to garden.
Of all the writers of classical Greece, it's only Plato who mentions Atlantis, and he gives us the key clue for our search.
Electrical storms. Of course, in this case, we're speaking about storms created in a past environment when Earth's electric field was amplified to the point the entire atmosphere was ionized. Imagine the atmosphere stirred into a maelstrom, lit with streamers of glowing plasma, where lightning crackled, not only in the sky, but across the land, and mountaintops glowed with coronal fire under swirling clouds of dusty plasma. It would have been surreal, a place where streams of wind became electric currents, where high and low pressure zones acted like battery terminals, and mountaintops became electrodes drawing machine gun lightning from the sky. Anything standing in the wind would have hissed and snapped with coronal fire. Dust in the air would have acted strange, too, as the energy of free electrons collided and overpowered weaker atomic bonds, ionizing matter, causing it to act like a ferrofluid under the influence of a magnet. Ionic species segregated, forming unipolar winds that tore past each other in opposite directions, creating shear zones of intense electrical discharge and vortex winds of supersonic speed. The inside of Earth would have been in turmoil as well. Hot magma spewing from volcanic vents, aquifers boiling, explosive eruptions of steam from deep underground, pocking the landscape with holes. Even arcs would erupt, lightning from the ground, caused by buried pockets of charge where minerals and water ionized. The winds, dust-laden and electric, deposited the Colorado Plateau, plating a cake across the western half of North America in the same way semiconductor manufacturers layer circuitry onto silica wafers. The stratified layers are interspersed with magma flows, petrified forests, inland seas, and dinosaur boneyards of different ages that indicate it formed in a series of events that likely recurred over millions of years. To create the canyon lands, the voltage potential had to reverse and eat away at landscape laid down by the storm. Under the electric field of an electrical storm, the surface of the Earth becomes positively charged. It becomes the anode in the circuit where lightning strikes from the negative cloud base and where rain falls. In primordial ionic storms, like those that form the plateau, rain did not fall, but silica did, as dust in the air fell and adhered in layers to the dome. Inland seas or layers washed over by tsunami, generated by the storm itself, became covered over with more layers of dry overburden as the storm progressed. This left a moist layer, like icing in the center of the layer cake. This icing layer then ionized under intense bombardment from sputtering discharge in the eye of the storm, and created what is known as barrier discharge in the moist layer beneath the ground. Which brings us back to Arches National Monument, proof that canyons were carved by sputtering discharge, aided by barrier discharge in a layer of the big cake. This image tells most of the story. A band of rock looks tortured and fluid, as if it were boiled mud when it solidified, sandwiched between smooth, more or less even layers of stone. The canyon floor is flat, which is surprising if one accepts the consensus view that canyons were made by water erosion. Water erosion leaves deep channels in V-cut valleys, not flat floors. This closer image shows the fluidity of the layers. At the top, the overburden rock barely sinks into the sagging layer beneath it that turned plastic, because it was still solid. The plastic layer beneath sagged, but didn't compress and maintained a consistent thickness. Below that, on the bottom, the boiled mud layer fluidized completely and squeezed like toothpaste. What turned this bottom layer fluid and caused it to sag beneath a solid overburden was electric current, a barrier discharge current, where no gaseous atmosphere was present to ionize into plasma, but instead the moisture and minerals in the layer ionized, generating a subsurface current. The moist layer ionized and charged species pooled into a plasma-like mud the electric field wanted to lift away. The electric currents boiled the moist layer, and it began to foam and arc into the drier and electrically resistant overburden. When sputtering removed the surrounding overburden, pressure released and vapors expanded, making gas bubbles that raised the arches. Hardened pinnacles formed where mud boiled up in convective blossoms of hot ionization to eat through the granite, collecting the current into single arcing paths and starving the diffusion currents around them. There are many other evidences of sputtering discharge in the Utah Canyonlands. In Part 2 of Sputtering Canyons, we'll examine some more. Thank you.
That's daily, and if in box, the rising of Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter. They're there. It's there. Now, they've been trying to eradicate astrology because the Christian Church does accept it. But actually, they're the only group in the world that doesn't. The Jews are based in astrology. You can see the remnants of it in the Christian Church with the 12 apostles. They've replaced the houses of the zodiac. And if you go into a Hindu temple, when you firstly go in, on the left, you'll see 12 constellations as deities. When you go all the way around the temple to see all the other persons in the temple, then there's the 7 planets. If it's a bright, sunny day when you wake up, it's having a good effect. If the clouds get between you and the sun, it filters that good effect. Now, for plant life, aquatic or tidal behaviour, all feminine life on the world planet is governed by the moon. That's why we call it a menstrual cycle from the word moonstrel cycle. And the other word we say is a lunar cycle, lunatic. And the law knows, the police know, and every authority knows that as the moon moves into its full position, it has an esoteric effect on humanity. Many, many more stupid acts will be occurring around the full moon. Do they affect us? Absolutely. The sun and the moon are the strongest on the earth.
Sirius B goes around Sirius A into a negative thing, using it as a means to
radiate fear out on the planet as opposed to love.
The people who got their hooks into this information, disinformation, misinformation, have really hoodwinked humanity's progress. So in the movie, for instance, 2012, there's fear and loathing. This is so far away from what the potential is.
Because if you can radiate fear, that can keep that frequency, which is expanding and growing higher, contracted. That, to me, suits the 2012 agenda.
Well, with regard to 2012, the media is not the place to source for information. It'll be misinformation, and it'll be negative.
Coming out of the Grand Canyon. In ancient times, and in my book on Lost Cities in North and Central America, I actually have maps and stuff in there of this. The whole West was much different in ancient times, and California especially. If you look at a good relief map of California, you can see instantly what it was like even just a few thousand years ago, and that is that Central California was a huge inland sea. And all around Fresno and that area, I mean, that's what they call the Central Valley. I mean, if ocean levels or California had just, had been shifted a little bit, that whole area would be flooded, not only from the Golden Gate area, but also up from the south, the Salton Sea, areas like that. And in fact, there were Finger Lakes already going up into Nevada. I did, some years ago, I did a show for the Discovery Channel and the Learning Channel, and it was all about giants and the legends and lore of giants. They flew me to Reno, where we went to Lovelock, Nevada, which is right near where they do the Burning Man festival now every summer.
Right.
And but what is in Lovelock is fascinating, because in Lovelock is a state park known as the Lovelock Caves. And in those caves, what happened was these ranchers began excavating this cave at the turn of the century, and they were looking for bat guano. And there was just tons of bat guano inside these caves. And as they started digging out the caves, they started finding artifacts. Now, the Paiute legends of that area had talked about these red-haired giants coming by boat up around Lovelock. You couldn't do that today. Try and go by boat from the ocean to Lovelock. I mean, it's 1,000 miles of desert.
Can't do it, yeah.
That's right. So their legend was that these giants, red-haired giants, came in boats. Even that area around Lovelock is still some lakes that are drying up today. And, I mean, there's just some marshes there that are the remains of these ancient lakes. And archaeologists and geologists say, yeah, there were lakes there, although, I mean, it's a problem with geology. Geologists think everything's millions of years ago, when in fact these lakes couldn't have been that long ago, because the Paiute Indians still had legends and stuff of it. I mean, it was only some hundreds of years ago, maybe 1,000 or something like that. Well, so the Indians have these legends of the red-haired giants. When these ranchers began digging out the bat guano in the Lovelock Cave, they started finding duck decoys, baskets, all kinds of hunting and fishing tools for a lake, a large lake. And then, incredibly, they found a number of skeletons. And these skeletons were like 7-foot-tall people. They had long red hair. They dragged like a dozen of these skeletons out of the cave. This all was around the turn of the century. Get this, George. There are 2 museums in Nevada today, one in Lovelock, one in Winnemucca. Those museums are wholly dedicated to the finds of California at Berkeley. Actually did the excavations. They know that these things came out of these caves. People at the museum talked about a photo of a rancher standing on a crate holding one of these giants by the hair. And, I mean, this thing is huge. And he told a large person with red hair.
Right. And at that time, that was really a giant.
And here's the thing. That photo of that giant, every single one of these giant skeletons is utterly missing. No one knows not only where the skeletons are, They don't even know where photos of them are. Okay? There's 2 museums in Nevada that are all about these discoveries. So here you have a double enigma and then a triple one where there's apparently some kind of cover-up, and these rather unusual items have just vanished. But you have these giants. They had red hair. They sound like Vikings or something like that, actually. And on top of that, they apparently were going by boat up into, you know, the Black Rock Desert of Nevada. How about that?
An earlier binary arrangement of the solar system is widely speculated to have been dominated by Proto-Jupiter and the Sun. An ancient satellite sharing a common barycenter with the Sun, Proto-Jupiter was likely comparable to a sub-brown dwarf star and may have been in an inflated hot phase of development at this time. So-called hot Jupiters, giant planets with masses comparable to Jupiter, orbiting extremely close to their host stars, are quite numerous in nearby star systems. In light of the abundance of these hot Jupiters, it was recently proposed that Jupiter likewise formed in the innermost parts of the primeval solar system. While the Jupiter we know has since cooled off and is now parked safely far away, the very fact that hot Jupiters exist in other systems at all is very real and remarkable, and suggests that the bodies in our solar system were not necessarily formed where we find them today. Indeed, an unresolved issue long besetting the Nice model is its inability to account for Saturn's relatively late arrival in the context of Jupiter's early formation and evolvement. Simulations consistently suggest that Saturn must have been either strangely absent or relatively far removed at this time. Cicero famously ascribed an ancient, wide-ranging, boundless course to Saturn that eventually necessitated Jupiter's intervention. While the actual beginning of the drama is difficult to pinpoint, there was eventually a point at which the two giants approached each other closely. Echoing Ralph Jurgen's suggestion that Saturn was the invading star to a Sun-Jupiter binary, modern cosmologists now seem to concur. Initially far away, Saturn swiftly approached Jupiter, accelerating exponentially in a runaway migration towards the Sun. Perhaps Proto-Saturn was initially captured by the Sun from beyond heliopause, or perhaps Proto-Saturn had been ejected into a far-ranging solar orbit by an earlier interplanetary encounter, eventually swinging back around to perihelion like a comet, converging on Proto-Jupiter and the Sun. No matter how its inbound trajectory was originally initiated, Proto-Saturn would possess an accumulated charge potential befitting colder, more distant reaches of space. As such, Proto-Saturn would be likely to sport a preponderance of positive voltage with respect to the relatively low-voltage Sun-Jupiter binary. Thus, Proto-Saturn would eventually be captured by Jupiter and the Sun simply because their opposite charges would attract and draw them closer and closer together.
About them as well, huge devastations that take place and wipe out life on Earth. But higher beings at that higher level of reality have the means and the resources to repopulate the Earth when that happens. And I think that has happened repeatedly.
Yeah, that's how genetic memory works. People talk about the possibility that instincts and things like that are actually memory, some type of genetic memory that we can tap into, as if each human is a computer tapping back into that cloud of information.
Yeah, something like that. Of course, I would explain it in a slightly different way that, the soul or the conscious
Fetuses
self
have a personality
maintains
already.
contact with a subtle body of mind and intelligence that incorporates memories. So in one lifetime, a whole group of memories would be imprinted in the mind and intelligence. And when, at the time of death, the soul leaves the body, it goes with the subtle body of mind and intelligence, so that over many, many lifetimes it accumulates. In other words, in our minds today, there are memories not just from this lifetime, but memories from perhaps many millions of lifetimes that we've existed on this planet, in human bodies and plant bodies, animal bodies, so that sometimes we have memories of things that just didn't occur in this life, or in dreams these things may come out. We may see things or hear things or experience things in dreams that we really can't trace to anything that's happened to us in this life.
Where did the Earth come from? It is known that there are more brown dwarf stars than bright stars. Some astronomers have recently realized that a planet orbiting such a star closely could be the place to look for life. But brown dwarfs, like all stars, are an electric discharge phenomenon. Their visible diameter, like that of enormous cometary comas, is an electric discharge phenomenon and much larger than the star's solid surface. So the fundamental mass-luminosity relation used to derive the mass, age, and size of a star form the character of its light is inapplicable. Let me try that again. So the fundamental mass-luminosity relationship used to derive the mass, age, and size of a star from the character of its light is inapplicable. The electrical nature of stars removes the foundation of stellar astrophysics. However, a binary pair of brown dwarfs has been discovered, which allow the determination of their masses and diameters by another method. The result was that both dwarfs are remarkably large in their masses, for their masses, about the same diameter as the Sun. That's about the same size as the coma of the comet Holmes. Their masses were said to be 35 to 55 times Jupiter's mass. The Sun is about 1,000 times the mass of Jupiter. Although the mass was not a measure of the amount of matter in a body, although the Sun is about 1,000 times the mass of Jupiter, although the mass is not a measure of the amount of matter in a body, another major spanner in the works of stellar astrophysics, brown dwarfs of that size are considered to be too small to initiate thermonuclear fusion. But that isn't so in an electric universe, where all bodies receive electrical energy from the galactic circuit. For example, consider Jupiter as an independent body moving in the galaxy inside its radiant plasma sheath, analogous to a cometary coma. It would be regarded as a brown dwarf star. And even if that glowing sphere were half the size of Jupiter's present magnetosphere, which is about 10,300,000 kilometers in diameter.
Getting resources and sharing those resources and spreading them around. You know, it's not, for me, when I think about it as an archaeologist, it's not just the implements and the level of technology. It's the wider network that would have had to be developed to make that happen. You know, where the copper was coming from, how far away that was, and what I find students are always really surprised by is the extent of those kind of trade networks that we don't see again in this country. until much later.
There was every pressure to see the Indians as intellectually inferior and primitive, and a whole set of policies that would keep them from showing that they were as intelligent and could do as well on their own if they had access to capital, if they weren't excluded from the opportunities of other Americans.
I veer this.
As the archaeology developed as a new science and anthropology as a new science, and they would find these things, these evidences to show that there was a written language, that these people possibly did smelt iron, they did smelt copper, and they mined it, they carried it, trade over great distances. These were signs of a higher civilization. And that higher civilization idea or theory coming from our educated scientific community of the day became directly in conflict with the manifest destiny ideas put forth by the U.S. government.
Well, it's not surprising to me that Native people in this area at this time were working copper and had extensive knowledge of copper. As an Anishinaabe person who's from Michigan, I can tell you how critical and central copper is to our way of life, even today. With it being so central, of course, we had to be very skilled at mining it and having it be getting resources and sharing those resources and spreading them around. You know, it's not, for me, when I think about it as an archaeologist, it's not just the implements and the level of technology. It's the wider network that would have had to be developed to make that happen. You know, where the copper was coming from, how far away that was, and what I find students are always really surprised by is the extent of those kind of trade networks that we don't see again in this country until much later.
There was every...
Hieroglyphics of ancient Egypt, to our knowledge the birthplace of scripture, were also known as sacred signs and revolved around symbols. When we look up the word symbol from Old Greek symbole, this is what we come across. In the broadest sense, a symbol is a device used as an identifying mark. A symbol is also the key to understand and recall the transcendental and timeless values it represents.
The development of Sumerian civilization occurred in the Persian Gulf while growing to strength over time. The plain of the land of Shinar is the territory that was renamed to Babylon after 2000 BC. These people lived in the Middle East on the territory we know as Iran and Iraq today. The Greeks gave it the name Mesopotamia, and which was commonly referred to as the land between two rivers. Most of this region lies in the modern state of Iraq. The tendency to...
With the Nita gods and the Shemshu or Aku, and whom it is said appeared in Egypt from a submerged island. We also have to include the origins of the Hindu Naga, serpent deities, who also came from a lost island. There is evidence that the ecliptic centre was the abode of the Father God, as this was actually named Anu.
It's Jupiter's atmosphere. The instrument on board Juno designed to peer into the atmosphere has a range of 350 kilometers, and it seems the Great Red Spot extends down even further than that. Also interesting is that the spot is cooler than the surrounding area, up until a depth of 80 kilometers. And beyond that, it actually gets warmer than the surrounding area. This heat perhaps driving the storm. It has been theorized that the Great Red Spot is a permanent feature on Jupiter, but we've only had about 400 years to observe it so far, a mere blink in astronomical timescales. Looking over the poles, other possible permanent features have been observed. In contrast to Saturn, which has a hexagon on one pole and a single vortex on the other, Jupiter has 5 vortexes around the South Pole and 8 around the North. It's hard to say exactly how permanent these storms are as Juno has only been there for 3 years. And Juno was the first time we have really been able to have a good look at Jupiter's poles.
Now this is
the end of it, according to them. Venus is inside the red zone, according to mainstream.
I meant vice versa.
Saturn theory overview. The Saturn theory arose from a historical argument, in the sense that that argument relates to the human past, as implied by the details of human memory in ancient times, and by human artifacts, in ways
the dollar is
that
queued
will
up
be obvious.
as soon
However,
as this is
the
over.
historical argument raises numerous questions of physical fact and physical theory, some of which will not be readily resolved, and several of which may well stand as serious obstacles in the minds of skeptically minded, feet-on-the-ground folks. One obvious and immediate question is whether something as ambiguous as myth could actually qualify as evidence. The historical argument focuses on points of agreement in the memories of widespread races, suggesting levels of coherence, often missed by historians and anthropologists, and raising the possibility that this coherence arises from a core of human experience that has been missed as well. There is an overarching idea in this argument. We've not only misunderstood the past, we've failed to recognize the consistency of ancient memory in pointing to extraordinary events never considered by modern
Failed
science.
to recognize.
Remarkably, every motive of our
Same
early
story.
ancestors directs our attention to experiences impossible to comprehend in terms of any natural phenomena occurring today. This consistency will be seen even at the most fundamental levels of human memory and the most deeply rooted themes of the first civilizations. 1. The universal memory of a former age of the gods. 2. The universal memory of an ancestral golden age inaugurating the age of the gods. 3. The universal memory of a celestial king of the world, whose life inspired the ancestral leap into civilization. 4. Description of the gods as luminaries of immense size and power, wielding weapons of thunder and stone. 5. The universal claim that the ancient world evolved by critical phases or cycles, punctuated by sweeping catastrophe. 6. Global traditions of gods and heroes ruling for a time, then departing amid terrifying spectacles and upheavals. 7. The frequently stated transfiguration of the departed gods into distant stars. 8. The identification of the ruling gods with planets in the first astronomies. 9. The relentless urge of star worshippers to draw pictures of celestial forms never seen in our sky. 10. The desperate yearning to recover the semblance of a lost cosmic order. 11. Their collective efforts to replicate in architecture the towering forms claimed to have existed in primeval times. 12. Their festive recreations through mystery plays and symbolic rites of cosmic violence and disorder. 13. Their reputation through ritual sacrifice of the deaths or ordeals of the gods. 14. The brutal and ritualistic wars of expansion, celebrated as a repetition of the cosmic devastation wrought in the wars of the gods. Such motives as these constitute, in fact, the most already verifiable underpinnings of ancient ritual, myth, and symbol. How strange that in our incessant glance backwards, the builders of the first civilizations never remembered anything resembling the natural world in which we live. What is needed in the face of unusual but widely repeated memories is brutal intellectual honesty. How did human consciousness emerge from the womb of nature, converge on the same improbable ideas, contradicting nature? For centuries we've lived under the illusion that our ancestors simply made up explanations of natural phenomena they didn't understand. But that's not the problem. What the myth makers interpreted or explained through stories and symbols and ritual reenactments is an unrecognized world, a world of alien sights and sounds, of celestial forms, of cosmic spectacles and earth-shaking events that do not occur in our world. That is the problem. From an evaluation of the global themes of ancient cultures, we have hypothesized a world order never envisioned by mainstream theory, a world in which planets moved on different courses, appearing huge in the sky. Heaven-spanning celestial forms dominated human imagination to the point of obsession at the time of civilization's birth. Our contention will be that hundreds of ancient themes speak for a unified experience, an experience more specific in context and detail than any of us had ever imagined when we started our research. No universal theme stands alone or in isolation from any of the others. All are connected. All speak for the presence of a coherent memory beneath the surface of seemingly random detail. In offering these summaries, I am not asking or expecting anyone to embrace the extraordinary theory of planetary history involved, only to consider highly interesting evidence. One of the values of this reinterpretation of evidence is the model works, and it explains the subject matter. Hence, whatever you may think of the claimed events, merely discovering the active memory will throw remarkable new light on the ancient structures of human consciousness. In the course of these summaries, questions and challenges will be welcome, and wherever possible, I will try to incorporate these into the narrative as we go along. End of Part 1. David Talbot. VELIKOVSKY'S COMET, Part 2, Venus, Smoking Star. In arguing for the cometary character of Venus, Velikovsky cited Aztec records suggesting the planet Venus shared the same title given a comet. The early traditions of peoples of Mexico, written down in pre-Columbian days, relate that Venus smoked. The star that smoked, the Estrella que humeva, was Citlal Cholula, which the Spaniards called Venus. Now I ask, says Alexander Humboldt, what optical illusion could give Venus the appearance of a star throwing out smoke? Sahagan, the 16th century Spanish authority on Mexico, wrote that the Mexicans called a comet a star that smoked. It may thus be concluded that since the Mexicans called Venus a star that smoked, they considered it a comet. In Bob Forrest's mind, the Aztec references could have nothing to do with what may or may not have happened back in the mid-2nd millennium BC, because the references to Venus smoking came from the 16th century AD. In a number of instances, Aztec records say that Earth shook and the star Citlal Venus smoked. To account for the curiosity, Forrest simply accepts the guess of Alexander Humboldt, who suggested that the smoke related to the volcano Orizaba, situated to the east of the city Cholula, and whose glow, when seen in the distance, resembled or was symbolically related to the rising morning star. Forrest was apparently satisfied with the first guess he uncovered. All we have are some 16th century records which say every so often that the star smoked. But since the smoking seems frequently to be intertwined with earthquake activity, Humboldt's assumption seems reasonable. With that stated, Forrest moved on, never returning to the issue of the Aztec smoking star. A quite different approach would have been to explore the possibility of a broader Venus-Comet association, to see where the available evidence leads. Guided by this intent, Forrest would have quickly found, for example,
that Aztec association of earthquake activity with smoking stars belonged to the general mythology of the comet among the Aztecs. Thus, with respect to the comets portrayed in the Codex Vaticanus and Codex Tellerino-Remensis, the respected authority on Mexican astronomy, Anthony Aveni, writes, "Comets are represented frequently by surviving historical documents, usually by a stellar image on a blue background with emanating streams of smoke. These usually signify that a person of nobility will die. For example, one picture of the death of the ruler Tenochtitlan followed the apparition of a comet. Later, another comet occurs, then an earthquake, all of nature's events being connected in the Aztec cosmic view. As I hope to demonstrate fully in this series of articles, the connectedness of these images derives from a universal substratum of myth. Appearance of a comet, death of a great ruler, quaking earth, not in Mexico alone, but in one ancient culture after another. The skywatchers repeatedly placed these unusual themes in juxtaposition. Despite this crucial fact, no comet observed by science has ever justified the symbolic connection. But Forrest seems unaware that the language employed in astrological texts and omens is drawn from ancient mythical images, following his methodological ground rules. Therefore, no records of portents in the sky recorded in the last 3 millennia would be of any relevance to Velikovsky's argument, even when repeatedly attached explicit cometary images to Venus. With respect to the image of the planet Venus as the smoking star in the Codex Tellerino-Remensis, Aveni offers his own attempt at an explanation. Perhaps a cometary object appeared near the planet. Of course, Forrest could just as easily have cited this guess, then dropped the whole issue. But is there something more worth investigating here? Throughout the Americas, including Mexico, natives called a comet the star with hair, or long-haired star, or main star, an appellation that fits comfortably with the global language of the comet. In fact, the long-haired star is the single most common phrase for the comet around the world, and our own word for comet comes from the Greek kametes, the long-haired star. Yucatec Maya dictionaries give a gloss for smoke star, or main star. But curiously, the Aztecs used this very language for Venus. As noted by Velikovsky, they called the planet Zantemoc, meaning the main star, or long-haired star, and not the Aztecs alone, for one finds among the Maya the same enigmatic association of the planet Venus with long flowing hair. A commonly observed Maya hieroglyph is the Coben curl, a flowing tassel or lock of hair repeatedly attached to acknowledged Venus systems, including the glyph name of Venus itself. To encounter the long flowing locks of Venus, one need only consult available sources. Turn to the Incan language of Venus, for example. I can remember in the first few days of investigating images of Venus, looking through a standard summary of Incan mythology, and encountering the name of Venus as Chesca, translated as long-haired star, the precise phrase for the comet in the global lexicon. It was instances such as this that continued to fuel my own interest in learning more. According to William Prescott, Venus was known to the Peruvians by the name of Chesca, or youth with long curling locks. Burr Cartwright Brundage tells us that among the Inca, Venus was the radiant star with flowing hair, the morning star, Chesca, the disheveled one, dispensed stories of freshness and loveliness upon flowers, princesses and virgins below. She was the deity of the rosy cloud rack of morning, and when she shook out her long hair, she scattered the dew upon the earth. The point here is that Forrest's explanation of the Aztec Venus smoking star association fails to acknowledge converging lines of evidence. Aztec comet as smoking star, Aztec Venus as smoking star, Aztec and Mayan long-haired star as comet, Aztec Venus as long-haired star, Mayan Venus with or as flowing lock or tassel, Incan Venus as long-haired star. Hence, the methodological issue is placed in sharp relief. Here is another way of looking at the issue logically. Around the world, there are only a small number of pre-astronomical hieroglyphs for the comet. You could, in fact, count the primary glyphs on the fingers of one hand. Heart, soul of a deceased god king, or great leader rising in the sky. Long-haired star, star with flowing locks, mane, tresses, disheveled hair, beard, hairy tail. Torch star, ember, flame, smoke, smoking star, train of fire, spark or train of sparks. Celestial feather, winged star, soul bird, bright feathers, feathered headdress, shining bird's tail, cosmic serpent, dragon, or similar monster. The remaining general hieroglyphs for the comet could be counted on the fingers of your second hand. They include a sword, a bundle of grass or straw, whisk broom, or a spiraled rope, cord, tie, or knot. At what point, then, does a coincidence or seemingly irrational use of language, comet words or glyphs attached to Venus, become an anomaly worth pursuing? Forrest not only sidesteps the implications of parallel cometry, images of Venus in other lands, he ignores the convergence of such images in Mexico. As the methodology, the approach is disastrous because there is much, much more.
And next we have Quetzalcoatl. In the popular Aztec myth of Quetzalcoatl, the Venus comet anomaly grows by leaps and bounds. And in this case, the completeness of the commentary motifs leaves no room for ad hoc explanations. Whether remembered by the Aztecs as a former great king and founder of the Golden Age, or a former sun god ruling a primordial epoch, Quetzalcoatl was the cultural hero without equal in the Aztec pantheon. His continuance adorning temple walls and the stucco bases of pyramids, painted on countless frescoes and codices, and engraved on sarcophagi and monoliths strewn across Mexico. The climatic event in the Quetzalcoatl myth is the god's catastrophic death and transformation in an overwhelming disaster, an event endlessly repeated in sacrificial rites, and supplying the cornerstone of Aztec calendar rituals and astronomical symbolism. In a pervasive version of the myth, at the death of Quetzalcoatl, the god's heart and soul, the god's heart or soul rose in the sky as a great spark or ember, trailing smoke and fire, a star whose fiery train the Aztecs portrayed as the streaming tail of the Quetzal bird.
The point of that this video has been proven for me. I put it in to just accentuate on the last phase, and that was Venus, the comet Venus. David Talbot does a very thorough job of pointing out all of the clues and evidence there. And, you know, you had to have Venus do that, or the whole thing would be moot. Because the big story comes from the Iliad, where Venus and Mars fight it out. Okay. I got some Eric Dollard here. Hold on 1 second. All right. I'm going to play that for you right now. Right now, baby. Okay. Okay, here we go. Boom.
Wire, and I compound it on itself once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Each of the current flows passing over and over give the effect of a higher current. So if I have a current of 1 unit flowing through a wire, if I take that wire and coil it around so that every part, the wires are going in the same direction, will be 1 amp, 2 amp, 3 amp, and if I put 100 turns of wire on there, I have 100 amps. Now I have a magnetic field that makes iron jump around on the table, not just compasses. And this was the beginning of the electric motor and the telegraph relay. The telegraph relay kind of had a weird start in all this because it was developed by a painter by the name of Morse, who knew nothing about electricity, but enough experiments had been done that it was now known that electricity could be conveyed with a transmission structure from point A to point B. A monk in, I think it was France, did the final experiment of connecting the entire town's folks together, hand to hand with 25-foot pieces of wire in between, and discharged a giant electrostatic condenser, which at that time had just been developed by Franklin. And everybody jumped simultaneously. They made a line 1 mile, and everybody jumped together. And at that point, that was the final proof that electricity was then thought instantaneous and can be conveyed to any point. You know, it was a madhouse place, you know. Lots of bottles of wine going down in his guts all the time. Drugs I've never even heard of before. But at any rate, that's where the action. When you live on the street, you're more tolerant. So he goes into his room and he pulls out this screwed up cardboard box, about this big. He dumps it on the table and he goes, "Well, you're so smart. Tell me what these are." And I go, "What do you got here?" He goes, "These are my father's tubes." Okay, well, I knew about the TV, but these weren't TV tubes. Okay, so I pick up the tubes. I've been playing with tubes since I was 6 years old. My grandmother used to build them in RCA. It's just in my genes. I look at these tubes, and these things they're crazy. Anybody would say this is insanity. Okay, big giant grids, but no cathodes, and like electrodes sticking out of the side, and all this stuff. And you know, but the thing is, I know how to make tubes. So I'm looking at him, and I start to see what's going on here. You know, he's sitting there. Remember that cartoon character of that dog that would laugh with that kind of horse after the dog screwed somebody that screwed him? I forget the character. That's exactly how Philo laughed. It was that kind of... You couldn't really hear it. It was kind of like a growling inside. He was content. So I pulled this one tube out, which was just an empty quart of glass, and it had an umbilical cord, so to speak, that came off of it to pump all the air out during operation. It was a laboratory tube. They broke it off the pump and, you know, and discarded it after the experiment. It had two little metal shells pointing at each other, kind of like two little mirrors, coated with some kind of crappy-looking stuff, silver cesium oxide compound, and a simple ring in the middle. Well, it's a simple, you know, electrostatic focus tube with an anode in the middle, and the two plates, and little tiny wires came in because the voltage was so high. And I guess it had to be oil or something around. It looked like it operated about 100,000 volts, which is a lot for a small tube. But I look at the glass had been all attacked by something. So it used to be in the old color TVs, there was a certain tube that shorted out the high voltage so that it couldn't get out of control. It's called a shunt regulator, 6BK4. And they glow every color in the rainbow and make the TV repairmen sick. And what it does is it turns the glass, the radiation turns the glass on the tube chocolate brown. And that's how you can tell how long the tube's been in the set. So I'm looking at this glass, and it's like all baked by some kind of incredible electrical activity that couldn't have come through those little tiny wires. So I go, Philo, something took off in this tube, didn't it? Then he stopped laughing and got all crappy with me again. I go, Philo, tell me what happened in the tube. And so he told me I could see what happened. What happened is and this is about 1932, is Farnsworth was working with a radically new vacuum tube technology that did not use any of these glowing cathodes or any of these emitters. The patent situation back then was such that RCA owned radio. You couldn't build anything. That's what started in Bolinas with the Alexanderson system. Lit this thing up, a star appeared in the middle, turn off the power, and it stayed there for a brief period of time. So that changed my life forever. So here you have this giant laboratory and all these billions and billions and billions of kilowatt-hour dollars being expended and all the grooviness and frigate bird activity that goes along with it. And here's some guy in a laboratory on Green Street in San Francisco, okay, on a poverty existence because he's never got anything out of television, does the same thing in an empty bottle, for so to speak.
Where are the two now?
The Farnsworth family still has them, but it doesn't stop there. So what happened is my first laboratory got destroyed in San Francisco, and that's when I lost most of the RCA equipment. That's all based on the campaign slogan, Diane will make a difference. So that's when San Francisco basically swirled into the outgoing tide. So my 8 cents a square foot went to $1 a square foot. So now how are you going to move tons of switchboards 15 feet high, transformers that weigh 4,000 or 5,000 pounds? Commonweal already smashed the rest of it at RCA. The Park Service got my warehouse at Fort Mason Pier 3. So everything went to the dump. And it was time to eat out of garbage cans again for another couple of years. So what I did is I made friends with a high school kid up there in Bolinas who was a prodigal genius type thing that Philo had trained at an early age. The kid was a genius beyond belief in a lot of different areas. He started hanging out with me. So we built a laboratory in his bedroom. So what I did is I took some of the remaining pieces from RCA and configured them. I decided, well, there's nothing else to do with this stuff other than make a Tesla coil. But make it the way Tesla decided to make it. At any rate, to make a long story short, we worked with this and experimented, went out to RCA, got more transmitter parts, because, I could always go back out and get more, because the station was still operating then. We build this thing, I take old burned out street lights, we're using the experiment, we get dumpster loads of them from Lease Light in San Francisco. The street lights off of Van Ness Street. They pull them out every certain amount of months. There's a whole dumpster full of them somewhere. There used to be. We put the street light in these monopolar fields that I just described from these coils, and the street light that we used for this experiment was the one we'd used previously for all of our spark gap experiments and everything, and something had started to transform with the bulb. We put this thing in the field within a matter of a minute or two of working the thing in the field. You have to be careful because they explode violently. Full galaxy appears inside the bulb, just like a picture of one of these Nova TV deals. You can spins, whole thing, the stars, the nebulas, the suns, all the colors of the rainbow is spinning inside a burned out street light and virtually powering and containing itself, which has gone beyond the Farnsworth. Now we have a whole astronomical creation floating around in a light bulb on a workbench, and then it explodes the bulb. But after it explodes the bulb, for like 1/10 of a second, it's not long, it sits there without any bulb to contain it. That's the creative force. This electrical monopolar field is how creation comes about. There is no evolution or any of that type of stuff. It's the electrical field at the time creates what exists, and it's always changing this way and that way. All living organisms are all based, just like all machines, are all based on the same mathematical function. All trees, plants, flowers, humans, everything's based on what's called the golden ratio. It's a definite geometric pattern, and all these electrical discharges associated with these Tesla transformers are all golden ratio proportioned and tend to be self-organizing and self-powering. So that ends the story. $1 trillion in the Livermore laboratories, and a deranged high school kid and a homeless person go beyond it in the laboratory.
The birthday of Mithra was celebrated on December 25th. Mithra is depicted as being born from a rock. He is shown as emerging from a rock already in his youth, with a dagger in one hand and a torch in the other. He is nude, standing with his legs together, and is wearing a Fijian cap. Sometimes he is shown coming out of the rock as a child, and in one instance, he has a globe in one hand, and sometimes a thunderbolt is seen. He is also known as Sol Invictus, the divine sun, or the unconquered sun, Mithra. The Phrygian cap Mithra wears is the same cap worn by Santa Claus and his elves.
time when you're watching a DVD only is dictated by where you are in the DVD. So when you're watching here, your past is there and your future is there. When you're watching there, your past is there, your future is there. And yet it's only dictated by that part of the information field that you are decoding at that time. There is only the now, that which is all. There is no time and space within that dazzling darkness. It's illusion.
Time
it's a perception of
is
time
what
that
clocks say.
And this is a great line. The present moment is the
Einstein.
only moment available to us, and it is the door to all other moments. Why? Because there is only that moment. And the more we get pulled into the future, fear, more we get pulled into the past, regret, we're getting pulled out of the now into some illusory past and future. And what the left brain does is it takes information in that now and it puts it in a sequence. And that sequence appears to us to be the passage of time. We're back to the DVD. Einstein said, when you are courting a nice girl, an hour seems like a second. When you sit on a red-hot cinder, a second seems like an hour. That's relativity. Relativity is what? Your perception of how you decode reality.
By 250 million years ago, the reptile mammals had gained ascendancy and ruled the Earth. And it is from these creatures that the primitive warm-blooded mammals, the therapsids, would descend, eventually giving rise to the first true mammals, then primates,
So there
and finally
were
woman and man.
Reptimammals.
But the emerging
Think
New
about
World
that.
Order was completely toppled 250 million years ago when the planet on our solar system smashed head-on into debris from the dwarf galaxy Sagittarius, which had been snaking around the Milky Way. Stars were being ripped from the Sagittarian Serpentine galaxy and were raining down upon the Milky Way, directly in the path of our sun and solar system. Of 35 large species of mammal, including the giant mammoths.
Obviously, this is the
According to
mainstream
nuclear scientist
explanation.
Richard Firestone of the U.S. Department of Energy, these meteor storms were accompanied by a hail of cometary bullets which struck the Earth,
There's
machine
no
gunning
lightning.
innumerable animals and humans with iron-rich grains traveling at 10,000 kilometers per second. When this giant comet exploded, many comets circle our solar system and can take hundreds or even tens of thousands of years to complete a single orbit. Some orbit once and then exit the solar system, apparently never to return. In July of 1994, huge chunks of a giant comet named Shoemaker-Levy slammed into Jupiter at a speed of 135,000 miles per hour, punching holes in the upper atmosphere many times the size of the Earth.
Those scars are in the atmosphere. They're
This giant comet had
electrical
broken into
stars.
fragments due to Jupiter's incredible gravitational tidal forces. Yet many of the comet's 21 separate pieces were over 1 mile, 2 kilometers in size.
Jupiter destroyed him with a thunderbolt.
On July 18th, a huge chunk of this comet hit Jupiter with the explosive power of over 6 million megatons of TNT, which is the equivalent of 600 times all the nuclear weapons on Earth exploding at the same time. Temperatures on Jupiter soared to over 24,000 degrees Kelvin. Over a 6-day period, 21 separate pieces of this comet slammed into Jupiter. It was as if Jupiter had been struck with all the nuclear weapons on Earth 25,000 times, the equivalent of over 600 million nuclear weapons exploding over a 6-day period. Enough firepower to destroy our planet and eradicate all life. If these 21 separate pieces of the Shoemaker-Levy comet had slammed into the Earth, our planet would not have survived. There are millions of meteors and asteroids orbiting in our solar system, and many times more probably have not yet been detected. Currently, NASA has detected over 5,000 asteroids. Many of their paintings show a complete mastery of geometric awareness, and they often use the natural contours of the cave walls, including protuberances, to create a three-dimensional effect.
Grouch, are you out there? Can you hear me? Is there anybody out there? Just nod if you can hear me. Is there anyone home? Relax. Grouch. Yoo-hoo! Grouchy! Are you there? Well, I never. So anyways, I was doing some research on the TR3B because it fascinates me, of course. And, you know, they got this dude named Futche, the first guy to come out that was believable to me. And he talked about this. And this was in 1998. Well, we know now it's a reality. He said, you know, it's pretty crazy. I mean, they just, you know, and the Vimana thing, it just so happens, you know, it's Mercury. I mean, they spin the Mercury. Well, that's what they did. They spin the Mercury it's under extreme pressure, 250,000 Earth atmospheres. That's pretty crazy. And according to some calculation, 10,000 Tesla. But it only removes the weight. It cancels the weight when they spin that. I'm wondering how they don't get radiation sickness. They must have some kind of natural protection. I don't know. Sitting there, you know, and they get 89% off. Then they put nuclear rockets on it in a triangle because it was a solid frame. And it can go Mach 9 in the atmosphere. They haven't said anything about space. I heard a figure, 0.8c, but that's pretty hard to believe. That's 0.8 the speed of light. I don't know if... Wow, that's pretty crazy. I mean, if we could do that, then, I mean, traveling to the stars wouldn't be far off. I think that they're way further ahead than we think they are. For sure.
And then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like a snail, unwillingly to school.
I haven't the foggiest what's on this. I think I did it on Twitch and transplanted it over.
stay where you are.
He's got a point. It's hard to refute. It's fused. What happened there? Seems to me it's a fingerprint or a calling card or whatever you want to call it. It's a definite fingerprint.
I feel obligated to warn
For
you.
sure.
At any time you are conscious of a tingling sensation, you may obtain immediate relief by screaming.
Rama Airlines
true,
could be the
actually.
name given to a powerful fleet of the past. The fleet of a rich prehistoric empire ruling over northern India. Exists in the mind. The outer phenomenon, that which appears, is only its outer expression. The visible
You're going to have 24.
in India. It was highly developed civilization, just like ours, or even more developed at its peak around 12,000 BC. The empire had 7 major capital cities called 7 Rises, located in northern India. And these cities, comfort and luxury were everywhere. Exquisite foods, exotic zoos, and aviaries, parks and bloom. The ancient descriptions remind of modern cities, and what follows is even harder to swallow. The Rama's planes could travel anywhere on Earth, and even go to the moon or stars. To fly from one city
That's
to
one
another,
that didn't
the
work
nobles had individual aircrafts called Vimanas, and also airliners called pushpacks. According to a Jain text of 850 BC, the pushpacks were overhead trolleys used for normal transport and could carry a lot of people from one capital to another. And all this took place in an atmosphere of science fiction from the 60s that makes you want to get a closer look. The show made by the Rishi cities was really weird. Let us hope that sooner or later they will learn also from the light, apart from the palaces and big estates
Let's try to
equipped
get
with
rid of that
sophisticated pipes. We can also see their factories, geoenergy power plants, lightning sensors, and alignments of small houses for workers. What an amazing modernity for the worlds before the Great Flood. Although they are the most concerned, archaeologists are unaware of these findings. They consider totally absurd. After a lifetime spent exploring the earliest Sanskrit texts, the expert in Indian culture, Allan Watts, has made a startling discovery.
I should stop this and just.
The Vimanas
show you
are
a few
described
and say,
with 2 large
what is
diamonds on the front and 2 smaller rubies in the
playlist
back. Diamonds
together,
shine in white, rubies in red. Just like our modern car lights, white headlights and red taillights. Denalou was amazed, and so are we. Even on details like the color of car lights, history is repeated. Enough to confirm the existence of the Akashic records. where everything is written. During the Silver Age, many flying machines crisscrossed the sky, showing the white glare of their headlights or the red glow of their taillights. What a magical show. How could we forget it? So when it was necessary to determine the color of our contemporary vehicle's rear lights, someone has remembered this former wonder. He simply had to make a trip to the great library of the universe. It is very easy indeed. You open the door of dream. You do it every night. Quotes, descriptions, and stories about Vimanas are numerous. Mahabharata and other scriptures of ancient India. You can find an attempt to classify them. The text distinguished three kinds of flying machines. Small Vimanas, to go from one city to another. Large Pushpakas, to go from one continent to another. And much faster gears to go into space. There's a Rukma Vimana. That's what it looks like. Our artist rendering. Vertical section. Please note, this only applies to the Indian subcontinent, because at that time, many other flying machines were moving everywhere. In the Middle East, for example, King Solomon did not despise the joys of flight. In Egypt and among the pre-Olmecs, it was also a custom with the gods. Among the Ashvin people, there was another kind of flying machine, the VELIKOVSKY, which could fly and sail, even under the sea. Thanks to this technological superiority, the Ashvins finally defeated the Ramas. Who were these Ashvins? Who were this rival high-tech people? Why not the Atlanteans? Then the Mahabharata would tell us the war of all against all. The war of the Atlanteans against the Ramas, of Zeus against Hecatonshires of the Anunnaki, against the great planners, the Elohim, a war of the West against the East, already probably doubled with a religious war. Already the Ramas worshipped a Trinitarian deity, and the Atlanteans themselves were strict followers of the One, as evidenced by the U.S. clairvoyant Edgar Futche. Notice to handyman, to build your Vimana, please follow the ancient manual. Strong and durable must be the body of the Vimana, like a great flying bird, made of light material. Inside must be put the Mercury engine with its metallic heating device underneath. Thanks to the latent power of Mercury, which allows movement, a man sitting inside may travel long distances in the sky. Nowadays, the use of Mercury on that purpose has been totally forgotten until the TR-3V, and that makes our bad scientists laugh. Yeah, and they're in on the fix. The movements of the Vimana, I always think there's an R in there. It's Vimana, like a mage's mana. Vimana, are such that it can climb vertically, descend vertically, tilt forward and back. With the help of machines, human beings can fly in the air and eventually return to the ground. No one could invent out of nothing so compelling technical details. Studying these descriptions, U.S. researcher Richard Thompson makes a fundamental distinction between the two kinds of Vimanas, corresponding to two different technological approaches. All reality exists in the mind. The outer phenomenon, that which appears, is only its outer expression. The visible universe is the reflection of the invisible. Plato. Interesting. Go over to the two different types of technologies.
Because ultrasound is extremely important. One of the people who realized that was Dr. Royal Rife. In 1931, he invented the microscope. And for the first time, someone was able to see live viruses. This is the structure of the viruses. Incidentally, they have a shape of pyramid. Now, of course, the microbes, includes viruses and bacteria and some bad cells organisms, They are the base of all our diseases, including cancer. Now, Dr. Reif not only invented the microscope, but also he invented the machine to produce the ultrasound.
They
And
threw him
then he
in
was
a
checking the
crazy
effects of
house.
different frequencies
Yeah.
of viruses. And then he was able to find the frequency that kills viruses.
In science, there are no sacred truths. All assumptions must be critically examined. Arguments from authority are worthless. Whatever is inconsistent with facts must be discarded or revised. We must understand the cosmos as it is, and not to confuse how it is with how we wish it to be. The obvious is sometimes false, the unexpected sometimes true. Carl Sagan, Cosmos, Episode 13, Who Speaks for Earth. If Velikovsky's celestial hypothesis is correct, it must not only correlate with historical evidence, but must also correlate with and be corroborated by scientific evidence. His thesis requires that there should exist unambiguous scientific evidence that celestial mechanics accepted by all scientists as being perfect as possible is in error. If that can be proved to be the case, that cosmological theory for the stability of the solar system and the evolution of the universe, birth and evolution of galaxies, as well as stars, must also be in error. The need for such a book that gathers the evidence for celestial mechanics, the cosmology of the universe, and especially the evolution of the solar system in recent times that Velikovsky presented is long overdue. Although I intend to present a great deal of new evidence regarding these matters, it is unavoidable that I will have to present materials already published in order to elucidate the problems. Possible solutions that faced Velikovsky, unstable solar system hypothesis, and possible solutions that face Velikovsky's unstable solar system hypothesis. In this respect, one must not only deal with the question of planetary orbital changes, but also of these changes in terms of their chronology and recent history into which these chaotic motions must be proved to fit. Hence, much of this book will examine not only the evidence for the very recent unstable orbits of Mars and Venus, but it must examine the chronological scientific evidence that conforms with Velikovsky's timescale, as both the evidence for the solar system instability and for the return to stability for the chronological framework that Velikovsky presented must agree if his theory is valid. More than that, these varied forms of scientific evidence must contradict the scientific establishment's hypothesis on the very same points. Much of this book will therefore deal with various forms of scientific evidence that contradicts the chronology of a stable solar system over, say, 20 million years. For those who have read Pillars of the Past, volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4, will remember I employed several forms of scientific evidence to analyze the chronology of the ancient world. In this respect, my approach to the established astronomical chronology of the solar system, like that of the ancient historical established chronology, will be based on presenting a great number of different forms of interdisciplinary scientific evidence that correlate and corroborate one another, but are also fully congruent with Velikovsky's hypothesis, and are clearly contradictory to, or highly problematic for, the thesis that the solar system has been stable in recent times. In the next part of this book, Velikovsky's concept of the important role electromagnetism plays in celestial mechanics will be examined, as well as its application to solar system stability, and also to cosmology. Thus, in a sense, this volume is a continuation of my book, The Electrogravitic Theory of Celestial Motion and Cosmology. As we will see in the next chapters, the astrophysicists, astronomers, and cosmologists have literally outdone Aristotle and the Greek astronomers, inventions of epicycles, by creating new forms of matter, new celestial mechanical forces, and even new dimensions of space. It has actually reached the point where many scientists are now saying the entire cosmological edifice upheld by these new forms of matter, energy, multiple dimensions, is a colossally false rendering of celestial reality. What has always been the problem for Velikovsky and his followers is the important role mathematics has played in all this. Up until now, we have assumed that Newtonian Einsteinian theory is as perfect as can be and perfectly reflects the forces governing the motions of celestial bodies. It will be shown that mathematics has played with a leading part in driving the entire scientific community regarding these matters of celestial mechanics blindly into error. This will be examined toward the end of the book, that too great a reliance and belief in the absolute validity only of mathematics to explain the universe is not just a modern cosmological blunder, but a repetition of these same blunders of the ancient past, like the Aristotelian geocentric theory. Between what has been assumed to be objective scientific truth,
The method and human psychology and sociology interrelate, and as these were understood by Velikovsky and others, it must be noted that those who attempt to criticize this book but ignore or who have failed to read the electrogravitic theory of celestial motion and cosmology are not dealing honestly with the materials presented here. The celestial mechanics presented in the earlier work will be greatly enlarged in this. Therefore, failure to understand that earlier evidence or deal with it as it relates to the foregoing evidence means that the critic is either ignorant of what scholarship requires or is determined to discredit this book's evidence without knowing it or even allowing their readers to know it. What I conceive to be Velikovsky's greatest problem and misfortune is that his ideas are so far ahead of his time that he had to be pilloried because the great paradigms and scientists whose concepts he challenged were false idols of his age, and it was inconceivable to the scientists, academics, and mass media that their idols could be wrong. Newton, Einstein, and all their theories, and those that had been derived from them, were the scientific idols of the 20th century, to whom all bowed as having established the indisputable laws that govern reality. This book is addressed to dealing with these giants and their theories, because this theory is largely derived from Velikovsky, who maintained that the planets in close contact could be cushioned by their repelling magnetic fields. I have maintained that these fields must weaken at greater distances, but are still operating in a repelling manner. Therefore, since this book is a defense of my own theory and indirectly of Velikovsky's celestial scenario, I take full responsibility for it. Velikovsky could not have known what would be developed and or derived from his recent unstable solar system theory, and cannot therefore be held responsible for what I produced. No more could Velikovsky be held responsible for the creationists that followed him. Nevertheless, this connection has been employed by Michael D. Gordon in his book The Pseudoscience Wars, Immanuel Velikovsky and the Birth of the Modern Fringe. It is a simple guilt by association critique of Velikovsky, and in no way proves anything about Velikovsky because it fails to examine Velikovsky's thesis, but only his connection with later other groups. As Tom Van Flandern tells us, the validity of an idea can be determined solely by an examination of its merits. This examination Gordon has not done, and thus his critique is shallow and beside the point.
Electromagnetism and celestial motion. Robert Millikan was asked whether he knew of anyone who had ever found a way of modifying or influencing the force of gravity. Millikan is said to have replied briskly, "Of course not. Such a thing is impossible and out of the question." Robert Millikan in Paul A. Lavallette's Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion, Rochester, 2008. Velikovsky challenged the concept that only gravity affected celestial motions when he wrote unambiguously, "The accepted celestial mechanics notwithstanding the many calculations that have been carried out to many decimal places or verified by celestial motions, stands only if the sun, the source of light, warmth, and other radiation, is as a whole an electrically neutral body. Fundamental principles of celestial mechanics, including the law of gravitation, must come into question if the sun possesses a charge sufficient to influence the planets in their orbits or the comets in theirs. In the Newtonian celestial mechanics, based on the theory of gravitation, electricity and magnetism play no role." He further held that gravitation as an electromagnetic phenomenon. In that citation, Len E. Rose pointed out that Velikovsky had moved away from some of these positions. It should be noted that during the last 2 decades or so of Velikovsky's life, the ideas that had been expressed in Cosmos Without Gravitation, 4 Plans of the Universe, no longer reflected Velikovsky's approach to the extent that they once did. In particular, he backed off considerably from the idea of circumduction as a non-gravitational, non-inertial account, sufficient in itself to explain orbital motions. He also backed off from any general suggestions that gravity and inertia might somehow be banned from the celestial arena. He took such a pounding over it. What he often said in his later years was, not that gravity and inertia played no role, but rather that they did not play the only role. That is, that gravity and inertia were not alone responsible for what occurred in the celestial arena. Electromagnetic interactions also played a considerable role in cosmic events, especially when celestial bodies were in close approach to each other, but also even when they were far apart. In any case, each of the 4 planes of the universe, even the 4th, should be taken as a construction, a working hypothesis, for the purposes of discussion. Not as a final position. The same is true of cosmos without gravitation. Not all of the ideas that were formulated in that early monograph were ones that Velikovsky continued to adhere to in his later work. Nevertheless, it must be emphasized that Velikovsky did not ever abandon the idea that gravity itself might eventually be interpreted as an electromagnetic phenomenon, nor did he ever abandon the idea that the solar magnetic field might, to some extent, be responsible for the fact that the planetary orbits are roughly coplanar. This, then, is the general concept that Velikovsky believed celestial mechanics rested upon. Nevertheless, before proceeding, it must be pointed out that Robert J. Shadwell, on the advice of one of Velikovsky's disgruntled followers, brought up Cosmos Without Collision and cited it without ever letting his readers know that Velikovsky no longer agreed with much of that material, but clearly and anger-driven claimed these were still Velikovsky's positions. Nevertheless, Velikovsky's electromagnetic concept is now out in the scientific community, and as we will see, it is growing. As was also pointed out above in the chapter on celestial mechanics, there are several aspects of celestial mechanics that cannot be correlated mathematically without Newtonian theory, but require an additional force, electromagnetic force, in order to operate. Miles Mathis, who well understood the depths of maniacal rage this Velikovskyan concept held for his critics, pointedly states astrophysics, who would have to admit that Velikovsky was at least partially right, would rather tear out their eyeballs and eat them than go there. In terms of Freudian psychology, the great underlying neurotic problem of humanity is the Oedipal complex, as outlined by the Greek playwright Sophocles in his trilogy Oedipus. Oedipus, unable to deal with the fact that he had violated every moral aspect in his life, when discovering that he had actually done so, gouged out his eyeballs, unable to face his behavior. So, too, the scientists of this generation, according to Mathis, rather than admit Velikovsky was at least partially right, would rather tear out their eyeballs. Velikovsky was related. I'm just picturing that. Velikovsky has related a story he liked to tell. Once in the twilight hour, a visitor came to my study, a distinguished-looking gentleman. He brought me a manuscript dealing with celestial mechanics. After a glance at some of the pages, I had the feeling that this was the work of a mathematical genius. I entered into a conversation with my visitor and mentioned the name of James Clerk Maxwell. My guest asked, "Who is he?" Embarrassed, I answered, "You know, the scientist who gave a theoretical explanation of the experiments of Faraday?" "And who is Faraday?" inquired the stranger. In growing embarrassment, I said, "Of course, the man who did pioneer work in electromagnetism." "And what is electromagnetism?" asked the gentleman. "What is your name?" I inquired. He answered, "Isaac Newton." When Velikovsky awoke, on his knees was an open volume of Newton's Principia. This story is told to illustrate what I have said before. Would you listen to anybody discuss the mechanics of the spheres who does not know the elementary physical forces existing in nature? But this is the position adopted by astronomers who acclaim as infallible a celestial mechanics conceived in the 1660s, in which electricity and magnetism played not the slightest role. Let us first examine the reaction of the astronomers to evidence that electromagnetism plays in celestial mechanics, before looking at the experimental evidence related to it. This brings us the first part of the Velikovsky affair, when critics of Velikovsky's concept that electromagnetism plays a crucial role in celestial mechanics was debated and forcefully denied. What we will see is that in each and every instance, when a critic leveled a charge against Velikovsky's electromagnetic concept, and it was shown to be an error, and further the evidence instead supported Velikovsky, the critic never faced up to that counter-evidence,
and acted as if the counter-evidence never existed by retreating into a state of silence and denial. Let us now look at these early critics and the evidence. The first critic was Donald Menzel, director of Harvard College Observatory, as explained by Ralph E. Juergens.
The mental
In
midget
1952,
himself.
in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society, Menzel had offered calculations to show that if Velikovsky were right about the electromagnetic forces in the solar system, the Sun would have a surface electric potential of 10 to the 19th, 10 billion volts. An absolute impossibility, according to the astronomers. But in 1960, V.A. Bailey, emeritus professor of physics at the University of Sydney, claimed that the Sun is electrically charged and that it had a surface potential of 10 to the 19th volts.
Looking. Yes. How'd you go? Okay, we'll tune out and listen.
So, cosmology must address the infinitesimal as well as the infinite. So let's go to the heart of the matter, because, incredibly, mass is undefined. In every textbook and encyclopedia, the amount of mass is confused with the amount of matter, perhaps because they both begin with the letter M. This means that no scientist understands E equals mc squared. This confusion allows particle physicists to talk of creation and annihilation of matter, which is impossible without understanding what matter is. It's not physics. E equals mc squared is simply telling us that mass is a measure of the amount of energy held in matter. Particles have no mass, we're told. Armed with this ignorance, the standard particle model says subatomic particles have no intrinsic mass.
Mike wasn't on. This is one of my favorite
Are
WAL
they saying
Thornhill
protons and
lectures
electrons have
ever.
no rest
He
mass,
slays
no
them.
energy? It seems so. In the standard particle model, mass is provided externally by a kind of cosmic treacle of imaginary Higgs bosons. The total cost of finding something, dubbed the Higgs boson at the Large Hadron Collider, ran over $13 billion in July 2012. At a running cost of $1 billion a year, that makes it more than $17 billion wasted chasing the grin of the Cheshire cat. The LHC operates like smashing countless jumbo jets into mountains and picking over the debris to see how they fly. But the whole is more than the sum of the bits we can see. We are not dealing with closed systems. Even worse, it's like asking one of Douglas Adams' telephone hygienists to do the investigation. The investigators are not properly trained. Energy is undefined. All you will find in textbooks are examples of different forms of energy. The Big Bang is supposed to have originated from pure energy, which is nonsense when energy only makes sense in relation to matter in motion, with respect to all other matter. But matter hasn't been defined in any physical sense involving sensible internal movement. The quantum realm is weird. It's admitted by leading physicists that no one understands quantum mechanics. It's incompatible with Einstein's postulate of no instantaneous information transfer, and it seems to involve even the experimenter's thoughts in the outcome of some experiments. Once again, any experiment is not a closed system, as physicists like to assume. That is why the quantum realm appears weird. Light and the electric force are mysteriously transferred through empty space. We have all experienced the force between two magnets. What's happening in the space between them? The pioneers of electromagnetism knew there has to be a medium to transfer the electric force. They called it the ether. The ether has to be an electrically polarizable medium that fills the universe. In that way you can daisy chain the electric force directly. It's a longitudinal force. And applying the speed of light limit to that makes no sense whatsoever, because light is a wave motion. I think I've said before, that's like the difference between pulling on a rope and feeling the tug at the other end almost instantly.
That's
and
what I
waving one
was
end of the
looking
rope
for
and
and
waiting for the
forgot.
wave to get to the other end.
I'm one of the
Light
ether
is a
essay.
slow process in the
Okay.
universe. So if we have this ether that fills the universe, space is full. There's no such thing as a perfect vacuum. Einstein knew there has to be an ether, but his postulates somehow did away with it. He admitted that his theory of relativity would fail if the Earth's motion through the ether were detected. That's because his inertial frames of reference would not be equivalent. It would be like having one observer experiencing a gentle breeze from the ether wind while another might be suffering a howling gale. As it turns out, Dayton Miller repeated the Michelson-Morley ether experiments far more rigorously and at different elevations. He found an ether drift. Sadly, left hemisphere training denied and quickly forgot this fact. So let's have a look at the standard particle model. An atom, once a promise of fundamental simplicity, is really a nucleus within a hazy, probabilistic fog of electrons. The nucleus is some protons and neutrons held together by the mysterious short-range nuclear or strong force. The particles in the nucleus have a hidden, unknown number of weird, undetectable bits inside. These bits are appearing and disappearing in defiance of a principle of science that miracles are forbidden. Meanwhile, a recent report from the Large Hadron Collider suggests new findings that don't fit this model. Here's a snapshot of a proton by Professor Matthew Strassler. He writes, "Imagine all of the quarks, up, down and strange, that is U, D and S, anti-quarks, U, D and S with a bar on top, and gluons, a G, zipping around near the speed of light, banging into each other and appearing and disappearing." So a proton is said to be some quarks held together by some gluons, which are themselves the quantized manifestations of the strong force. There is no mention of how a force manifests as a particle. It gets much worse. A gluon is really one of several colours of gluon, but it also has the simultaneous property of anti-colour. Gluons mediate the interaction between quarks, but they also mediate the interaction between themselves and quarks. That's right, gluons are the strong force, but they also experience the strong force. Happily for the physicists, quarks are unobservable in principle because they only exist inside the nucleon. It's very convenient. This is simple. You can forget elegance. This is extreme, narrow, left hemisphere focus on a model with no basic definitions to make sense of the words being used. Andrew Pickering, the author of Constructing Quarks, who did a sociological study of particle physics, and it's an interesting book, says there's no obligation on anyone to take account of what 20th century science has to say. To listen too closely to scientists may be simply to stifle the imagination, that is the right hemisphere. Worldviews are cultural products. There is no need to be intimidated by them. We come to the electric universe model of the atom. The electrically neutral atom is made of charged particles, positive and negative, in equal numbers, together with a number of neutral particles called neutrons, stating the obvious. All subatomic particles are real, with real locations in space. It's not a probabilistic fog. There is a polarizable ether which transmits force and carries electromagnetic waves. The universe is full of an electrically neutral, perfect fluid of neutral particles which passes through atoms and celestial bodies practically as if they weren't there. Neutrinos fit this description. So, the electric universe then defines what it means by energy and mass. Energy is matter in motion relative to the matter in the rest of the universe. It used to be said in relation to the fixed stars. This is not a closed system approach. It is a unifying relational concept first articulated by Ernst Mach. So we define mass. Mass is a measure of particle distortion instead of acceleration in response to the electric forces from all other matter in the universe. It's a bit like pushing a balloon full of water. It will tend to distort rather than move. And it's the same with these orbital systems of electrons and protons and so on. Once again, this conforms with Ernst Mach's principle. Neutrons may not exist in the nucleus. If so, only two particles are necessary to build all of the elements. This idea came from Edwin Karl, who I'm pleased to say is here and will be presenting in the breakout room. And the problem for physicists is, how do you hold together all of the positive charges in the nucleus? They should repel one another very powerfully.
So is a cell the same as a solar
repulsion
system?
Of those positive charged protons should prevent it
held
from
in their
forming in the
orbit
first place.
by electric
However,
force?
atomic nuclei seem to require neutrons for stability. That's because when a radioactive atom nucleus decays, neutral particles are sometimes observed to leave the nucleus and exist for a few minutes before further decaying into an electron and a proton. So it was assumed such a neutral particle pre-existed in the nucleus. The what-if question wasn't asked, that maybe that wasn't so. This is an assumption which still does not explain how the positive nucleus remains cohesive. So a special short-range strong nuclear force was invented, a proliferation of forces and particles. Edwin Karl suggested a simpler solution. If the electrons remain as discrete particles in the nucleus, they will tend to arrange themselves to, on average, sit equidistant between the protons. Because the distance between the protons is greater than that between each proton and a neighbouring electron, the attractive electric force between the proton and electron, sorry if this is too fast, will be 4 times greater than the repulsive force. This simple hypothesis removes the need for an extra strong force within the nucleus. It's much simpler. And then it seems that neutrons are a short-lived, metastable resonance of a closely bound proton and electron. This is simple. The electric universe simply proposes structure within structure, a repeated pattern. To understand magnetism and gravity, we must go to the heart of matter, a similar approach to that of André-Marie Ampère, Carl Friedrich Gauss, Wilhelm Weber and Walter Ritz, who considered the behaviour of positive and negative charged particles of different mass with great success, but were ignored for political reasons. Chiefly they weren't English, I think. Here's a simple hypothesis. The electron and proton have stable, resonant orbital structures of smaller charged particles. In that case, the positron, that is the antiparticles, and antiproton are mirror particles. They're not antiparticles, they're mirrors. There is no antimatter, no creation or annihilation. But this requires that there be an ether of composite neutral particles of vanishingly small mass, the neutrinos. The neutrinos must be quite complex inside, but totally collapsed, so that they can accept energy and then become a particle and its mirror. But there's nothing, it's just assumed that when these particles seem to disappear, that they've annihilated, the matter has disappeared. That's not so. So the ether must be normal matter of vanishingly small mass composed of all the subparticles needed to split into an electron and a positron, for example, when subjected to the appropriate energy, electromagnetic energy. For stability, and this is one of the stumbling blocks, of course, for particle physicists to go this way, is that the electric force must act between the tiny particles within the atom instantly. No speed of light delay. The two stable particles, the electron and the proton, if we assume the neutron is just a metastable particle, form 254 stable nuclides plus another 85 metastable, that is radioactive nuclides, for a total of 339. So from this simple resonance systems of structure within structure, we have all of the materials we need to see, to make what we see in the world around us. When those nuclei combine with the requisite number of negative electrons to form atoms and molecules, the possibilities are boundless in the living world.
We'll see a bit more of this, a little bit of something else, and then
Only a
adios.
single force is necessary, the powerful, instantaneous electric force. The phenomenal strength of the naked electric force can be judged by the simple illustration in the lower left. This shows that if the charge passing through two 120-watt light bulbs in 1 second were to be transferred equally...
A little something, something. And it helped, too.
Yeah,
It came in handy, man, because it was a little behind there for a minute. But I'm okay now, but, it's just,
Yeah. Well, you say she'd be wanting a bit of that.
It's the way it is. Yeah, I know. She said, in court, she said, he's holding out on me. I mean, she looked really petty and really freaking just pathetic, really pitiful. And he's holding out on me. And the judge says, wait a minute, you're not married anymore. He doesn't owe you an explanation. And I went, oh, thank you. Jesus, it's about time. And everything went my way from that point on.
Yep. Anyway, we better get back to this.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to play one more thing, and then we're going to call it a night. I know, we got a little chat in there, but that's okay. We haven't talked in a while. So, all right, I'm going to get something going right here.
Right.
Okay, and then we will talk later. I just don't know what to play. You know it's time to go when you don't know what to play. How about something that I want to hear? Wow. Yeah, Mankind and Amnesia. Heck yeah, man, this is good. This is Velikovsky. Let's try to understand him for a little while. I want to hear him talk. I am going to turn it up a little bit.
I'm happy to be here and to see so many young faces. I am asked in 45 minutes to present my theory. Dr. Ingers presented it in shorter time. I nevertheless believe that I am in the position of that Gentile who came to Rabbi Hillel, an early rabbinic authority, and asked him to teach the wisdom of Judaism in the time that the man, this worship of pagan religion, was able to stand on one leg. And when he came first to Rabbi Shammai, he was a stern, severe man. He drove him out of the premises. But Rabbi Hillel, who was a kind spirit, he told him in one sentence what he's all about: love thy neighbor as yourself. And the story tells us that the Gentile was converted. I do not trust to convert you, but I hope to leave here some seeds, some ferment of thought, of scepticism, of new look at the universe and what is in it. In this short period of time that I have before me, there will be a question and answer period later. I will have to tackle so many fields of science, as many as my work ramify to. My beginning was with the Old Testament, here where I started. Maybe the years that I spent on psychoanalysis were not lost.
I fixed the
I was surprised to see things
CC
so
for you
obvious.
in case you want to read it.
Sometimes in my room, my office room, when I heard story of a patient, and so obvious was this, the situation, and the man was blind to it. And here is the Old Testament, and here is a story of some events related to the time of the Exodus, and it is in the book of the Exodus and of Numbers, and you find it in the prophets and in Psalms. Actually, the entire Bible, Old Testament, turns around this crucial point in the history of that nation. But the event that the story describes, whether it is in Psalms, whether it is in the story of the plagues, it is not usual events. And these were not miracles seen just by a couple of people. These were events that have been seen by the entire nation. More than this, the population of Egypt was involved, and if we think a little more, these events could not have been even limited to the land of Egypt. How, for example, the story of described in the book of Joshua, with the sun and moon disrupted in their motion. This would not be a vision just above the valley of Ajalon. It must have been seen all around the world. Wherever the day was still, and there where there was night, the night must have been more prolonged. And this is what we find. We make a travel, imaginary travel, from book to book, which means from land to land. And we read that the Mexicans and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Chinese, in all places of the world, the very events were observed, experienced, and they were certainly not events of, well, indifferent nature. I wondered, Joshua, in the book of Joshua, quoting from the book of Joshua, described this event in the sky, and stones were falling down just 2 verses before described, stones from the sky. Joshua could not know, could he, the connection between the rotation of the earth and entering the earth into a cloud of meteorites? Could the Indians on this continent know the connection between the sun appearing over the horizon, eastern horizon, dropping down, again appearing, dropping down, and all the continent, this continent bursting in flames? How could they know the connection? So they could not invent the stories. Something must have happened. The same in China. And at the same time, the tide, the earth is wrapped in rotation, so something must have happened to movable parts of it, to atmosphere and to water. So we hear or we read about seas that rose in gigantic tides that move, and the ocean was torn apart. Talmud says that not just the Sea of Passage, all the seas of the world were torn apart. Thus, as you see, we read with different eyes, with different mind, the Old Testament. Because otherwise it's really not understandable. What were these prophets talking about? What is the story about mountains that skip like rams or lambs, and hills? And do you understand what does it mean that nothing was on the outside, was a day like today, and the prophets talked to you about mountain melting like wax, sea erupting? If nothing of the kind happened. All the time spoken about earth trembling, and some apparitions in the sky, and coals falling down, and some dust falling down, and stones, dust that make the entire river and sea turning red. Oh, if these things really happened, there must be not only in biblical source, but also in Egyptian sources in the first place, a detailed record. I looked for it, I found it. Eyewitness describes the catastrophe, the very same plagues. Strange was to me that the translator of the papyrus, now in Holland, in the Museum of the University of Leiden, and there since more than 100 years. Papyrus translated in 1909 by Gardiner. He did not even feel that the very same verses that he translated in modern English, he could read in the story of the plagues in King James Version. This was also a case of some scotoma. But scotoma was with all of us. How is it that a book that was read more than any other book through many centuries, translated in scores of languages, commented upon by many commentators through many generations, that none of them was seeing or reading stone for stone and fire for fire? Even fundamentalists didn't imagine that mountain turning over means mountains turning over. But mountains turned over and moved from their places, moved from their roots. Here in America, we know that the Rocky Mountains moved many scores of miles. We know that Alps moved from the North Italy to where is today Switzerland. That Matterhorn was overturned because the younger formations, fossils, are at the bottom, and the older are at the top. We will have to limit discussion of each discipline just by a few minutes, and we are already in the field of geology. It was always thought that the mountains were created, or so to say, built in the Tertiary, which is back 60 million years, and the closest to us, 1 million years ago. But researchers, investigators who went to the Andes and to the Alps and to the Himalayas all returned with the same verdict: unbelievably young. Mountains were dragged up the Himalayas in time of Neolithic man, even in the time of Bronze man. The lakes, they are tilted, they are ancient shores. And in those lakes you find the vestiges of man, practically historical man. The same in the Andes. A city they are built where nothing grows, because it is over 12,000 feet high. No cereal grows, no big city could have existed there, but the terraces, agricultural terraces, go up higher and higher into the permanent snow cover, and don't know how far above 15,000 feet. So this entire antiplanar, at the shores of Titicaca, the largest lake in South America, was moved suddenly up by thousands of feet. And Darwin himself, when he visited Chile, observed undecayed shells over 1,000 feet high at Valparaiso. And he wondered. He wondered also seeing so many bones of animals, many of them that do not exist, many of them of giant form. And he exclaimed in his diary, but the entire globe must have been, the entire frame of the globe must have been shaken in order to destroy so many animals from Terra del Fuego to the Bering Strait. And this phenomenon of annihilation of large masses of animals, sometimes to the very last of a species, is observable on all 5 continents. In Alaska, where gold-digging machines slice so-called muck, myriads of animals are entombed in that muck, torn limb from limb. North of Siberia, islands are built practically of splintered trees and of bones of animals, not only of mammoths, none of which exist in our days, but also of horses, of buffaloes, of rhinoceroses. myriads of them. How would they come to the north? How would hippopotami invade England? Or maybe from more ancient time, how would it be that corals that do not grow even in Mediterranean were growing in Spitsbergen or on the island of Greenland or along the northern rim of North America? How is it that in those animal hecatombs you find together animals that could not live together, ostriches and crocodiles and polar bear and seal and Arctic fox? And the problem in geology is not only problem of annihilation of species, but also problem of origin of species. Practically question of evolution. How could so many species that populate the earth, and many more have populated without leaving a single descendant? How could so many species evolve just by the mere process of competition from the original simple form, practically unicellular form? Just by competition, can you understand how a crocodile and a bird and a worm and a man and an insect with many legs all could come to be? And the very question of fossilization, a problem that was never adequately answered. With Darwin, it is animals are wading in shallow water, dying when wading, being covered by sun before predatory fish would devour their cadavers. At the same time, in the same breath, Darwin claims that this process is going on only when the earth subsides. And the process is very slow, counted in thousands and tens of thousands of years. So where is the chance for a cadaver to survive in these conditions? And have you seen a cat wading in shallow water? So something different, a different process was at action. The sea erupted. Often the sea and land change places. The immutability of contours of continents and seas, a dogma in geology, has no basis in facts. And immediately we are at the problem of the climate. There were ancient climates that were very different from what are they today. If those corals grew where they were found, certainly the Earth was not traveling with the same elements of rotation and revolution, which means not on the same orbit, not with the axis directed in the same position as it is today. If you don't believe it, try to cultivate corals on North Pole. It is a problem of change of climate, and close to our time we know that 1500 BC and again in the 8th century BC, climate drastically changed. This was established long before I turned my interest to those problems, especially by Scandinavian authors. Exactly in those two periods of time, about which my first book, Words and Collision, speaks in two parts of it. The catastrophes of the day of the Exodus, followed by 50 years by the catastrophe in the day of Joshua, and again another series of catastrophes that happened in the 8th and beginning of the 7th century, in the time
Okay. That's going to probably just about do it for me tonight, although I am going to close with about 15 or 20 minutes of Danny Sheehan talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's important for people to know this important period in U.S. history. Basically, what most people don't really know is that there was pretty much a civil war going on for control of the country between President Kennedy and the military-industrial complex. And it was a lot more pronounced than most people think it was. And it was out in the open. It was called the Inter-Administration War. And the good guys didn't win, of course. You know that. I never really knew how deep it was, and it went until I really started to research it. And it's something that I'm really into, so I'm just going to listen to about 15, maybe 20 minutes of Danny Sheehan. I'll leave all the links and everything for anyone who's interested. And that will close it out for me tonight. Now I just have to find it. Okay, here it is. Cuban Missile Crisis. Why is it? Okay, wait a minute. That is the wrong. This is going to be it. Get some sleep. And here we go. I get weird though. I get these second winds, man. Be like my eyes are closing and I can't barely stay awake, and all of a sudden, I don't know, this wind comes from somewhere and I'm like, I'm wide awake. It's weird. But that might be the case for all night owls. Here we go. Sheehan on JFK Nixon 1960. And did you see the flying saucer? That was that's a real life case. They shot a warhead. It was a dummy. But a flying saucer came into the picture and shot it down. It was going 8,000 miles an hour, by the way. That's pretty amazing. And it's just nobody batted an eye. Where is Sheehan and the Missile Crisis? Here, Danny. Where you at, Dan? Dog it. You're letting me down, son. What's this? No. Well, I'm just going to have to take a pick. I think this is it. No, that's Silkwood. Have you ever seen Buddy Rich play the drums? Oh my God. The man's a beast. Check him out sometime. Where you at? I'm just going to grab the first one I see. Missile Crisis. Oh, that's not the one that I wanted, though. When Danny tells it, it's really good. Well, I'm just going to... I think it might be this one. I'm not going to play the whole thing. Just, I don't know, 15 minutes of it. It's really good.
Very, very important.
I'll put a slideshow
to
with
develop an ethos within the American defense establishment. It become very, very important because there began to develop an ethos within the American defense establishment, an intelligence establishment, right at the end of the war, that was basically being supported by Third Reich Nazi Germans that had been actually not only brought in to be the intelligence chiefs against the Soviet Union, but that they brought them in down to Argentina and Venezuela and Brazil, and they helped them escape from Germany, took them off the Nuremberg War Crime Tribunal list, and they set themselves up being advisors to the basic governments down in South America. Now, all of this is established by very clear historical documentation now, but it's not something that many people know about or think about. And so what happened is we had a reaffirmation at the end of World War II of the same kind of anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist, anti-socialist, pro-capitalist, kind of Nazi fascist elements inside our American government that were in coordination with these types of forces. And they pushed very hard at the end of World War II to establish the National Security Act of 1947. And the National Security Act of 1947 created the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency. They set up a special National Security Council in the White House, and they established a thing called the 5412 Committee. The 5412 Committee is based upon Section 5412 of the National Security Act of 1947, which they interpreted as authorizing them to engage in covert operations to attempt to promote and foster the national security interests of the United States. At the end of the war, Eisenhower, as you know, Eisenhower was elected in 1952. His vice president was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, for 8 years, between 1952 and 1960, as the Vice President of the United States, chaired the 5412 Committee. And in that capacity, he oversaw the covert operations that were undertaken by the Central Intelligence Agency to attempt to neutralize the forces of socialism in Europe. And very importantly, they were funded with a deep and dark black operations budget, which was never cleared through Congress, never authorized by Congress, never supervised by Congress, to conduct this covert warfare around the world. And this is that Richard Nixon had become, over this 8-year period, kind of the secret domo of this world. He ran the 5412 Committee. He's the one that authorized the covert operations. They're the ones that accessed the kind of covert operations money. They funded former Nazis all throughout Europe whose names had been changed, and they ran for public office. Their campaigns were financed through this secret fund. They opposed the partisans in France and in Poland and in Austria and other places. The very people who had opposed the Nazis and had fought the Nazis were suppressed by the United States intelligence community. And covert operations were undertaken to neutralize them, to disrupt them, and the fascist forces were actually positively funded by the American Central Intelligence Agency. Now, this sets the stage for Richard Nixon coming to power. And in January of 1959, now this is a year before the 1960 elections, where John Kennedy is going to be running for the presidency. You have at the end of World War II, one of the additional things, the point I left for a later discussion here, what other thing did they get Lucky Luciano and the Mafia to agree to do, besides infiltrate the longshoremen and the Teamsters Union, and to also agree to be scouts and assist the landing forces in Sicily, at Salerno, and in Normandy? They served as scouts for the American Allied landing forces. That the third thing that they got them to do was there was a secret program set up at the end of World War II, pursuant to which Jack Singlaub, General Jack Singlaub, was assigned to be the first CIA case officer to the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. And they oversaw the smuggling of heroin, actually opium, out of the Golden Triangle. And in collusion with the Corsican Mafia in France and Italy, they set up a heroin production operation that was actually smuggling heroin from the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia through Cuba. And Virgilio Batista, who was the fascist ruler in Cuba, a totalitarian military dictatorship, he became business partners with Santos Trafficante, who was the Don of the Mafia in Havana. And they put together a major heroin smuggling operation out of Southeast Asia, some of the profits for which were used to finance the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist Chinese of Chiang Kai-shek, who was attempting to oppose the rise of Mao Zedong to power in China. And the primary source of funding for Mao Zedong came through this heroin smuggling that was being coordinated by Santos Traficante and Batista in Cuba. The American Central Intelligence Agency had a company set up in Havana that was called the Sea Supply Corporation, S.E.A., standing for Southeast Asia Supply, headed by a full-time CIA officer by the name of Paul Helliwell. Paul Helliwell ran this operation, taking some of the profits from the heroin sales that were being supervised very, very important because there began to develop an ethos to attempt to neutralize the forces of socialism in Europe. Had been changed and they ran for public office. Their campaigns were financed through this secret fund. They opposed the partisans in France and in Poland and in Austria and other places. The very people who had opposed the Nazis and had fought the Nazis were suppressed by the United States intelligence community. And covert operations were undertaken to neutralize them, to disrupt them, and the fascist forces were actually positively funded by the American Central Intelligence Agency. Now, this sets the stage for Richard Nixon coming to power, and in January of 1959, now this is a year before the 1960 elections, where John Kennedy is going to be running for the presidency. You have at the end of World War II, one of the additional things, the point I left for a later discussion here, what other thing did they get Lucky Luciano and the Mafia to agree to do besides infiltrate the longshoremen and the Teamsters Union, and to also agree to be scouts and assist the landing forces in Sicily, at Salerno, and in Normandy? They served as scouts for the American Allied landing forces. That the third thing that they got them to do was there was a secret program set up at the end of World War II, pursuant to which Jack Singlaub, General Jack Singlaub, was assigned to be the first CIA case officer to the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. And they oversaw the smuggling of heroin, actually opium, out of the Golden Triangle. And in collusion with the Corsican Mafia in France and Italy, they set up a heroin production operation that was actually smuggling heroin from the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia through Cuba. And Virgilio Batista, who was the fascist ruler in Cuba, a totalitarian military dictatorship, he became business partners with Santos Traficante, who was the Don of the Mafia in Havana. And they put together a major heroin smuggling operation out of Southeast Asia, some of the profits for which were used to finance the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist Chinese of Chiang Kai-shek, who was attempting to oppose the rise of Mao Zedong to power in China. And the primary source of funding for Mao Zedong came through this heroin smuggling that was being coordinated by Santos Traficante and Batista in Cuba. The American Central Intelligence Agency had a company set up in Havana that was called the Sea Supply Corporation, S.E.A., standing for Southeast Asia Supply, headed by a full-time CIA officer by the name of Paul Helliwell. Paul Helliwell ran this operation, taking some of the profits from the heroin sales that were being supervised by Santos Traficante and Batista, and purchased weapons and explosives and stuff and had them smuggled into China through Formosa to the nationalist Chinese. So Cuba had become a special place in this covert operation that was going on at the end of World War II. It became the major conduit of heroin coming into the United States, being sold by the Mafia in the black ghetto areas to provide financing, covert financing for the nationalist Chinese in Southeast Asia. Now, so at the time, therefore, Richard Nixon was a very prominent person in the 5412 committee, chairing the 5412 committee in the National Security Council. So he had contact with a number of these mafia characters. And what happened is on January 1st of 1959, the totalitarian government of Batista was overthrown in Cuba by a revolution led by Fidel Castro, a lawyer in Cuba. Leaders overthrew the government there. They closed down the heroin trafficking, they closed down the gambling casinos, they closed down the major houses of prostitution, and Santos Trafficante, the don of the mafia in Havana, fled from Cuba along with a lot of the major fascist allies of Batista. And they fled and came up to Florida, into Miami and Tampa. And that's why Nixon was regularly going down to Key Biscayne down in Miami. One of his closest associates was a fellow by the name of Bibi Rebozo, who was a major mafia assistant down there, very close to the Santos Trafficante, and also to Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky, another major mafia figure, set up a thing called the National Bank of Miami, in Miami, which was a mob bank down there. And in fact, it was Bibi Rebozo that made the major recommendation to Richard Nixon later as president to appoint the chief federal judge down in Miami, a man by the name of James Lawrence King, who was in fact a member of the board of directors of the Miami National Bank. So this is the situation that you've got in January of 1959. So when the Cuban government is overthrown, the Batista government is overthrown, and the revolutionary government comes to power, Fidel Castro and Raul Castro approached the American government saying that they wanted to be friends with the American government even though they were overthrowing one of their fascist allies. They wanted to be friends. Richard Nixon choreographed the policy of saying that the only condition on which the United States would recognize the new government of Fidel Castro is if they agreed to have no diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union or China. And Fidel Castro refused to do that. Very much as Ho Chi Minh refused to do that later in Vietnam, and the United States declared them to be an enemy because they had diplomatic relationships with China and with Russia. And so Richard Nixon mounted a major covert operation to attempt to destabilize and overthrow the new revolutionary government in Cuba. In the summer of 1959, Richard Nixon, in his capacity as the head of the 5412 committee, initiated this covert operation against the government in Cuba that was codenamed Operation 40. What he did is he recruited a whole bunch of mafia soldiers that had worked for Santos Trafficante down in Havana, that had been the muscle behind their houses of prostitution, their gambling casinos, and their heroin trafficking. And several dozen of these gunzels were brought in to work for Operation 40, operating out of Miami. And what they would do is they were working for the Central Intelligence Agency full-time, and they were mounting paramilitary attacks against Cuba. They were going in and blowing up bridges. They were burning entire sugar fields. They were poisoning foodstuffs that were loaded onto ships to be brought in or out of Cuba. They were attempting to carry out destruction of their economy in Cuba through Operation 40. In January of 1960, January 9th of 1960, Richard Nixon announces that he's going to be running for the Republican nomination for president. Okay, Eisenhower is finishing his second term. They had passed the constitutional amendment in 1951, limiting presidents to 2 terms. So Eisenhower had to leave office. Nixon announces on January 9th he's going to be the candidate for the Republican Party. The only realistic competitor for him was Nelson Rockefeller. And as of January 29th of 1960, Nelson Rockefeller withdrew from the Illinois primary. And it became very obvious that Richard Nixon was going to be the nominee. He was functionally unopposed. And on March 8th, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, respectively, both win the New Hampshire primary in 1960. On March 17th was the actual date on which Richard Nixon initiated Operation 40 against the Cuban government using Trafficante soldiers. On April 5th, JFK defeated Hubert Humphrey in the Wisconsin primary. Nixon was now completely unopposed. So what we saw happening now, they were setting up this operation where Kennedy was clearly going to be the nominee for the Democratic Party as of April of 1960, and Richard Nixon was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party. This starts the chronology that I laid out to you rather rapidly at the end of the session on Tuesday, which is what I came to discover when I was in F. Lee Bailey's office in May of 1973, in the midst of the Watergate burglary. We found this out because we were trying to figure out what in the world these burglars had gone into the Watergate Hotel to do, because it was so clear in 1972 that Richard Nixon was almost certain to win the presidential election. He was running against George McGovern. George McGovern was a very progressive guy, very much opposed to the war in Vietnam, and it was very likely it was going to be kind of an isolated ideological campaign on the part of McGovern, and Nixon was going to carry the election substantially. So it didn't make any sense to people as to why these people would go into the Watergate Hotel and burglarize the offices of Larry O'Brien. Now, so I was asking the same question inside our office. I needed to know why this had happened. And so what we discovered, partly from James McCord, but most importantly from Santos Trafficante, another one of F. Lee Bailey's clients. And that was this, that in about June of 1960, when it had become perfectly clear that Richard Nixon was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party, and it was they thought it was probable that he was going to win the election because John Kennedy was going to be the nominee for the Democrats. They viewed it as basically his old man, Joe Kennedy, having bought the nomination for him. And they didn't think that he could withstand Nixon's 8
That's
years
their
of
first
experience,
mistake.
contacts.
He had more
8 years of
experience
being
than
vice
anybody in
president.
Washington.
The Republicans have been in charge, for the entire 8 years.
His age is
Richard
moot.
Nixon, in June of 1960, contacts Howard Hughes. As I mentioned to you, Howard Hughes was this man who had been very, very prominent for 20 years. He was a major inventor, a major pilot. He owned a Hollywood television or Hollywood motion picture company. Had been married to 2 or 3 major actresses. He went into seclusion following his invention of what they call the Spruce Goose, this great big gigantic prototype for the C-5.
All of you guys over 50 will remember Howard Hughes.
He came out and personally piloted it down in Long Beach and flew it all over and landed, and so everybody was aghast at the fact that this really worked. He was so upset at the way he was being treated, he went into seclusion. And everybody figured
he was also involved in
and went away. Well, it turns out that what he
aircraft
did
design.
is he went undercover and he became a covert asset for the National Security Agency. He created a company called the Summa Corporation. He invented a thing called the Glomar Explorer that was capable of retrieving a sunken submarine off the ocean floor in the deepest parts of the ocean. He created a lot of other technological things for the National Security Agency, and a very important project, which to this day remains extraordinarily sensitive. But I'll tell you what it was. He was the chief operating officer in a thing called Operation Desktop, which was an attempt on the part of the American National Security Agency to construct a anti-ballistic missile system to install it on the continental shelf of the United States off both coasts. And it was in complete and total violation of the anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Soviet Union, but they thought they could get away with it covertly by creating a special type of submarines that could construct things underwater, and that was being run by Howard Hughes. And because of this, Richard Nixon, having chaired the 5412 committee for all these 8 years, had close communications and contact with Howard Hughes. And so what he did is in June of 1960, having been assured that he was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party, highly confident
I should give
he was
you
going to win
my
the national election,
commentary.
he contacted Howard Hughes via the confidential secure telephone line that they had, and asked Howard Hughes if Howard Hughes would create an assassination team for Richard Nixon, which would assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and the 5 other heads of the new revolutionary government. And in that conversation, Richard Nixon said, "You cut off the head and the snake will die." And Howard Hughes, in that conversation in the first week of June, did not agree or disagree with Nixon that he would do this. But what he did do after he hung up is he contacted one of his young lawyers, a fellow by the name of Robert Mayhew, and told Mayhew that the president, is how they were referring to him by now, Nixon, wanted to have this assassination team put together. And Howard Hughes delegated to Bob Mayhew responsibility for getting this done. Bob Mayhew then went, they were in Las Vegas. As I said, Howard Hughes lived above the big casino that he owned, a big gambling casino in Las Vegas. His lawyer, Bob Mayhew, went to meet with Johnny Roselli, who was the Las Vegas representative at one of the big casinos that was owned by the mafia. And his principal was a fellow by the name of Sam Giancana. He was the Don of the mafia in Chicago. And the lawyer for Bob Mayhew, the lawyer for Howard Hughes, met secretly with Johnny Roselli, said, "Look, my principal, Howard Hughes, has been contacted by the president, the upcoming president, Richard Nixon. They want this assassination team put together to kill these guys." He says, "And you guys in the mafia have your own reasons for wanting to get rid of Castro, in Che Guevara and these people. You want to reestablish your gambling casinos, your houses of prostitution, and your heroin trafficking. And you want to be able to do this. And so why don't you guys agree to do this?" And so Johnny Roselli flies to Chicago, meets with Sam Giancana toward the end of the first week of June, presents this proposition to Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana says, "Well, wait a second. You're talking about assassinating the president of Cuba. The Don in our organization for Cuba is Santos Trafficante. We can't do a thing like this without consulting with Santos." So what they do is they set up a set of meetings now in the middle of the second week to the end of the second week of June of 1960 at the Fontainebleau Hotel down in Miami Beach. And they go down and they have a series of 3 meetings. In the first 2 meetings, they discuss this proposition about whether they're going to be doing this. And they finally decide in principle that they will agree to do this. And so, Santos Trafficante says, "Look, I don't want to get caught short here and have someone try to blame this on us. I want to make sure that Nixon is the one who has authorized this to be done." And so what he does is he insists that some representative from Richard Nixon come to the 3rd meeting and give them the green light on this proposition. And the guy that comes to the meeting, as I mentioned to you, but you probably didn't get it last time, is he used the nom de guerre, Mr. Ed. It was Sheffield Edwards, who was the chief of security for the Central Intelligence Agency at the time, under Bill Harvey. This was done in 1960 in June. And so when he gives them the green light, then Santos Trafficante agrees he's going to do this. And what Santos Trafficante does is he recruits some of his former soldiers from the mafia down in Havana who are now working for the Central Intelligence Agency in Operation 40 under Richard Nixon. And he recruits them to become part of a highly secret unit they called the S-Force. S is in Sam, the S-Force. There are 15 anti-Castro Cubans in this, all of whom were working with the Central Intelligence Agency in Operation 40. These 15 men were spread out among 5 paramilitary bases that have been established in the southeastern section of the United States, one at No Name Key, one at Swan Island, one in the Everglades, and 2 in Louisiana at Lake Pontchartrain, one on the southern shore and one on the northern shore. And I repeat this because it's important for you to understand the details of this. And that what happened is there was a policy where private planes would go and pick these guys up, these 15 guys, and they would fly them to Fort Huachuca in Arizona. And they would sign in, and then they would just disappear. And they were flown secretly from there down to Oaxaca, Mexico. And they were housed at this ranch owned by Clint Murchison Jr., the son of Clint Murchison, the owner of the Dallas Texan football team, and the Santa Anita racetrack in California. Major contributors to the Republican Party, people that were supportive of John Edgar Hoover, who used to come with his friends to Santa Anita to race there. And this ranch was the Triangular Fire Team training station. And these 15 anti-Castro Cubans, Rafael Chichi Quintero, Ricardo Chavez, Rolando Martinez, Virgilio Gonzalez, these guys, there are a whole bunch of them that we know who they are, that they were trained there by a man by the name of Carl Jenkins. And they were trained in hitting a moving target from 3 separate locations with high-powered rifles to assassinate people that they chose to. And this operation was in full swing by August and September of 1960. When the election was held in November, however, there was a plan afoot already. Nixon was so confident that he was going to win the election that he started planning an invasion of Cuba, which he had planned to undertake right after he got elected to his first term as president in November of 1960. He was going to do this in April of 1961. He was going to stage this invasion where he was going to have the anti-Castro Cubans from Operation 40 go into the Bay of Pigs, set up a base, raise a flag, and announce the fish is red, this code name, the code word they had, at which point Richard Nixon was going to recognize that government as the new free government of Cuba, and there were going to be United States Marines on board ships, U.S. naval ships off the shore of Cuba that were going to come ashore and take over the island and knock out Fidel Castro. Okay, that was the plan of Richard Nixon. And John F. Kennedy was briefed by Allen Dulles in September about the existence of Operation 40. He was not briefed about the plan to invade in the Bay of Pigs in April of 61. And he was not briefed about anything about the S-Force. But he knew about the Operation 40, and so in their second debate in October of 1960, John Kennedy, in the debate, confronts Richard Nixon and says that you're soft on communism. You, in fact, aren't doing anything about Cuba. Cuba is sitting here 90 miles off our shore where there's a totalitarian government, a communist government there, and you're not doing anything. And Richard Nixon was completely livid because he is the one that created Operation 40. He's the one that was doing all this stuff. He, in fact, was even secretly planning to assassinate these guys. But John Kennedy corners him in the secret debate and makes him look like a weakling. And Nixon he was furious about this. And it comes to the election November 8th of 1960. John F. Kennedy wins, by 0.16%. He wins the election by 112,000 votes out of all the votes cast in the United States.
Somehow qualified him to become the director of the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. He was the architect of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. When he launched the invasion against Kennedy's orders, of course Kennedy fired him. So thinking people were shocked when he was...
Along with the cities of Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, Sodom and Gomorrah constituted the 5 cities of the plain.
Well, that's hard to believe. That was a 27-minute video. It went by pretty fast, didn't it?
Genesis describes God's
well, that's gonna do it for me tonight, folks. I'm kind of tired. I'm gonna get maybe a couple hours sleep before I gotta take my kids to school, and I'm gonna come out there and get a look at see who's there before I say goodnight. Had a great time, and we went 4 times. That's a record. Velikovsky's speech. Yeah, I didn't play the whole thing. Were you into it? Were you listening to it? Let's see. I want to get. Okay, turn that off. And put you guys on right here. Oh no, that's not the one. Okay, right there. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Roy Rush, No Center, No Border. Yeah, I did. I didn't finish the. Greg, please upload all of that speech. You mean the Velikovsky? You want me to finish it? I can finish it. I mean, if you guys, I mean, you know, we got a small crowd here. I can let you finish seeing it. And yes, I have it. It's in my playlist. It's in the Greg J playlist. It's got about 25 minutes to go, so I'll play the rest of it for you because you seem interested. So, and it is in the Greg J playlist. It's Mankind in Amnesia, and I updated the CC, so you know, in case you can't understand them.
Time of the great prophet Isaiah and Amos and Hosea and Joel. And these are a few only questions about geology
the slideshow
and climate.
Kind of weak, but it was the
and
first
just
time
this week you have the information that oceanographers who went to Mediterranean came with the conclusion that volcanoes, there is an island, volcanic island, Terra or Santorini, north of Crete, erupted with a terrific force. This was known already since quite a while, in 1500 BC. But they came with a new conclusion, and you can read it in this present issue of Time magazine. 50 years later, another similar catastrophe and eruption. But this is what I spoke about in first part of Rosen Collision about these 2 catastrophes, the catastrophe of Joshua that took place 52 years after the catastrophe of the Exodus. And the same period of time we have also the same interval in Mesoamerican sources, Mayas and Aztecs, Toltecs before them. To the question of volcanism in the past. Why was it so much? Of earthquake, we have even in the days of Punic War, in 1 year, something like 50 dispatches arriving in Rome concerning earthquakes. Which means that earthquake is a residue of those events that took place when the earth was twisted out of its position. And that it was twisted out of its position we learn from many fields. One is ocean itself. On the bottom of the ocean there runs a ridge twice around the globe with a deep chasm along it, discovered only 8 or 7 years ago, strangely enough so late. And on the bottom of the ocean we find ash in a level so of the same thickness. Under the bottom of the Pacific, and according to Morris Ewing, also other oceans, that he had only to make the conclusion that this so-called Wurzel ash was of extraterrestrial origin. And in the clay of the bottom is nickel that could be only coming from immense showers of meteorites. And if we leave the problem of paleontology and geology and ancient climate, and we only had a chance so shortly mention some problems of theory of evolution and of ocean studies and of paleomagnetism, to which I will add one sentence. In ancient rocks and lava we see magnetic field reversed and 1,000 times more intense than Earth could invest in them. Reversed suddenly. And we have in archaeology archives of cuneiform tablets with astronomical observation, very dry observation, mathematically exposed. The exposition is very simple. And you read and you find in these tens of thousands of tablets found in Nineveh, in the palace of Ashurbanipal that was destroyed in 612 BC. And these tablets were stored them from time earlier, observation of period before 7th century. All those tablets that are before 7th century are according to the Babylonian scholars, entirely wrong. But how could they be wrong? Why should they be wrong if the writing of those tablets was not an easy process? To observe, to impress in clay, to store just wrong figures for no reason at all. And there are tens of thousands of tablets like this in the British Museum alone. There are also manual of astronomy that describes the way of measuring, the way of observation, and there you find that the length of the day and the shortest day and the longest day of the year and the direction of the axis, the polar star, length of the moon, the movement of the planets, everything was different before 700 BC. This is really a field to study and not to neglect or reject, saying that this could not be true and therefore it is. These are imaginary figures. It is not legend that you make it. You are free to follow your imagination. And those Babylonians were very well versed in mathematics, admitted. And in archaeology we find so many other evidence, whether it is in historical texts, whether it is in foundation of the tombs, from the foundation of the temples, whether it is in tombs. We find again and again proofs of those catastrophes and changes in the position of the globe. Now we are approaching the field of astronomy. If the changes took place, apparently not the Earth alone, but many other members of the solar system were involved. In mythology we read about Theomachy, battle of the gods. And we wonder about this ancient text. Why, I ask again and again, why the ancient worshipped planetary gods? Jupiter and Mars and Saturn, or Zeus and Aten and Kronos, and others, Mercury, Hermes, all were more important to them. They were greater deities of the sun, light-bearing sun, light-bringing sun. There must be a reason for it. There must be a reason why temples were built. Do you know the explanation why Zeus was always in the speech of the ancient, why temples were built to it? Are you so impressed also by the planet Jupiter, that you would regard it as a chief deity above sun and moon. And they worshipped those planets, those gods in the planets themselves. They were lifting their hands, the Babylonians and the Indians, Hindu, and the Chinese, all of them were lifting their hands to those planets in worshipping them. And human sacrifice were brought to them. And even into recent times, among the American Indians, in the last century still, human sacrifice were brought to the planet Venus. Then we are really before questioning the fundamentals of astronomy too, cosmology and astronomy, because it was accepted that the solar system has no history at all. So it was created, if not 6,000 years ago, then 6 billion years ago. But then for 6 billion years there was no change. Whether it was created or came into being by tidal action of a passing star, which would be catastrophic, as the tidal theory wishes, or in growing out of a nebula theory that goes back to Kant and Laplace. But since creation there was no change. But if what I am telling you is true, then there were changes, and many, and very recently too. Therefore I claim that moon must be still hot under its surface. That lunar craters that anyway were explained in a catastrophic way, whether by large meteorites falling on moon when it was still in a viscous state, or by the process of volcanism, but it could be also by electrical discharges. It could be also by bubbling activity. And actually, since I wrote this, over 300 unburst bubbles, so-called domes, were detected on moon. And it was found that the moon is hot. Even not all of its lights come from the sun. Over 100 places were delineated that are glowingly warm, hot, and emit light. And gases are coming out of several of craters. And experiments with electrical discharge were made and repeated some of the forms of the circular formations. And Mars had participated in those events. Was found moon-like. There is no place there for any intelligent beings, as was thought when these so-called FINALI were seen first, the second part of the last century. And so it was found in that planet. And Venus must be hot if the history of the solar system is not a history of no change for billions of years. And Venus was found hot. Not room temperature, it was thought, until 1959. And in 1961, it was detected with radio means that it is something like 600 Fahrenheit. And Mariner 2 was sent out to find out true or not true. It was found that even more, it is full 800. And if it is true that Venus was a body that escaped, erupted from Jupiter, as the ancients saw and described, and Jupiter is almost 400 times as massive as Venus, then it must be covered, I claimed, by a thick envelope of hydrocarbons, which is petroleum-like products, polymerized hydrocarbons. And so it is. 45 miles above the planet, 15 miles thick, is this envelope of hydrocarbons, dust and gas. So the Earth and the Moon and Mars and Venus clearly were involved in some disturbances, and recently so. But if this is so, then I put before me also a question How could the thing happen if the laws of celestial mechanics are true? I figured out at unusual coincidence of situations it could have happened. A body and a long ellipse being retarded, meeting some obstacle would change to a shorter ellipse and then to a circle, which could have happened to Venus. And by the way, one of the leading cosmologists of our time, Littleton, came out in 1959, 1960 with a claim that Venus erupted from Jupiter, or at least from another giant planet, but most probably from Jupiter, on the basis of his calculation, not trying to prove me right. However, he put the time much more into the past. But then if there were events of this character, discharges between planets and so on, I put one of the most outrageous claims before the scientific readers, that in the solar system and the universe generally, not just gravitation and inertia are the two forces at action, but that also electricity and magnetism are participating in the mechanism. So the Lord was not just a watchmaker. The universe is not free of those forces with which the man makes his life easy already more than 100 years. They were unknown practically, or little known, in the time of Newton, in the second half of the 17th century. But today we know that electricity and magnetism, these are not just small phenomena that we can repeat as a kind of a little trick in a lab, that they permeate every field from neurology into botany and chemistry. And astronomy should not be free. But astronomers kept to that point. High tension, as if there is written such a sign in the sky. Don't touch the subject. And it was admitted by authorities that this was the most outrageous point in my claims. But the vengeance came early and swiftly. In 1960, already in 1955, radio noises from Jupiter were detected. And this was one of the crucial tests that I offered for the truth of my theory. In 1958, the magnetosphere was discovered around the Earth, another claim. In 1960, interplanetary magnetic field was discovered, and solar plasma, so-called solar wind, moving rapidly along the magnetic lines. And then was discovered that the magnetic field of the Earth reaches the moon. So, by today, it is the situation reversed. If I would come today in an astronomical assembly and remind those assembled there that only 10 years ago and less, they were, from the first to the last, completely opposed to any introduction of electrical magnetic forces as interrelations between the bodies in the universe, or even more so in the solar system. Today the memory is so sure that the people would start trying to remember, was it really so? But my opponents put it on record. I had a debate with the Royal Astronomer of England on pages of an English magazine, in Harper's with one of the astronomers of Princeton University, and so many articles were written against my first book that this is today on record. Now, in the few remaining minutes, I would like only to touch the subject with which I started. Actually, I told you already that the ancient religion, for some reason, and now you can guess what reason was, were started as astral religions. But I started as a psychologist, psychiatrist, and here before me a phenomenon. The things were seen. They were described not just in one verse of the Old Testament. Opened by chance. Any prophet page through the Psalms and see how many times. Actually, I was surprised to get recently from one of my readers an index to biblical quotations. There were over 230 of them in my first book, referring to those great upheavals, which certainly could not have been local, must have been global, must have been observed by every survivor. Then if these things were described so many times, not only in Old Testament, but in every ancient book, ancient sacred book, whether it is Vedas or Mexican inscription, you go to Guatemala, you go to Mexico, you see all the temples, all the figures are Quetzalcoatl, which is planet Venus, Huitzilopochtli, which is Mars, it's known. The description, the story about the bitumen stuff falling from the sky, about all the mountains changing places, rising new, erupting. So many times it's said in Mexican sources alone. Actually, they speak nothing else but about this. And then you read it, you stop at the motel, you find the Bible, you read it, and you don't see the most impressive things. Practically, that issue, that theme of the book. Then, for a psychiatrist, this is a phenomenon of scotoma. And this is an important issue. Because if the mankind actually, is suffering of scotoma and also of collective amnesia, and you can follow through the ancient literature and see how this amnesia overwhelms.
When you think about it, it's
how still somebody like Lucretius remembers.
Just about everybody
and his
has
contemporary and friend Cicero denies already. How the books of the New Testament and Revelation and Sibylline books, and before them the books of Stoia, repeatedly speak about phenomena which are today classified as vision of the last day.
Beauty.
The Stoia spoke about the catastrophe when the world was all aflame. And so actually the evidence comes from all places. And psychologists wonder, when the evidence is from astronomy and from ancient sources, whether astronomical minutes of the Babylonians, or legends, or sacred texts, or philosophical systems, whether from geology, from ocean, from the planetary system, then you wonder what this forgetfulness signifies for us. We are in a state of a victim of amnesia. Humankind is a victim of amnesia. And a victim of amnesia does not act responsibly. He acts irrationally. His technological progress outstripped his understanding of his milieu and of events in which his ancestors lived or succumbed. And it is a dangerous situation when a victim of amnesia plays with thermonuclear weapons. He enters into conflicts for which there is no reason. And in many of our actions, even as single individuals, we are sharing in that course of amnesia, of not wishing to know, of preferring to forget, of opposing to a book that said nothing more than was said already and told so many times in thousands of ancient sources. The very violence in opposition to that revelation is rooted exactly in this desire not to know. And this I feel my obligation. I'm going to campuses, speaking to the young, to tell them what you are taught is not complete. I put before you today 100 questions. I could not put more questions in the short period of time at my disposal. But one question is above all. The humankind is safe, reasonably safe, from a new destruction from above. The system came to peace, as in the Hebrew prayer, the Lord who made peace in the heaven should keep us in peace. But the danger is in the man himself, as one of my correspondents wrote to me. Is not this thermonuclear weapon itself a symbol for that destructive celestial body that exploded in the face of the earth? And the man likes to play and repeat that performance as a child, not knowing what he is doing. By now, my time is over. And you ask me questions. I will try to answer at the best of my ability. And thank you.
That's gonna do it for me, folks. I'm gonna say goodnight now. It has to end sometime. I had a great time. It was a good run. We got a lot of good video in there now to kick back and watch. Let's see who we got here to say goodnight to. Alchemy 88, good to see you aboard. No Center, No Border, holding down the fort. There you go, Velikovsky's speech. It'll be in the Greg J playlist.
Presume wrong, Doctor. If this Punch and Judy show is an example of what you expect here, Doctor, I suggest you don't bother to unpack. You may be moving on sooner than you think.
Lonesome in my bedroom, just me and myself alone. Lonesome in my bedroom, just me and myself alone. Well, I have no one to talk to each night when I go home. Bedroom without a woman, just like a heart don't have no beat. Whoa, a bedroom without a woman, just like a heart don't have no beat. Got the woman they love, and I wonder where can my baby be?